The next 3 hours are your chance to talk with author and journalist Amy Goodman. The host and executive producer of international radio program Democracy Now! Will talk about war, politics, and grassroots activism. The New York Times bestselling author has written or co-written 5 books, including The Exception to the Rulers, Standing Up to the Madness, and the 2012 release, The Silenced Majority.
Amy Goodman, in your first book, The Exception to the Rulers, you write, and you're quoting the Washington Post here, that Amy Goodman is the journalist as uninvited guest. Why do you write that?
Well, we're not supposed to be a party to any party. We are journalists. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution. We're supposed to be the check and balance on power.
In that book also, War and Peace, Life and Death. That is the role of the media in a democratic society, to provide a forum for this discourse. To do anything less is a disservice to the servicemen and servicewomen of this country. That's right. You know, I've just flown in from Denver, where I was at the National Conference on Media Reform. And when we flew into the airport, at Denver Airport, that's where people hold up signs when you come out to pick you up. And as we were walking, there were some soldiers there. They were going to be picking up a general. And as we walked by, they were waving. And I thought maybe the general was behind me because they had a sign for the general. And didn't look that way, went to baggage. I thought, you know, I want to go back and talk to them. So we went back, and I said, do you watch Democracy Now? And they said, every day. And so I said, really? Why do you watch? And they said, it's objective, and you cover war. You know, it is not about whether you're for or against war. It's about covering the most serious decision a country can make. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. As you quoted there, war and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, about whether they are sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. One of the recurring themes in your writing is the corporate media, as you call it. What is the corporate media, and what does it do or not do? Well, that's what most people see on television, on most channels, not all, and that's the hope. It's the channels, NBC, CBS, ABC, CNN, you know, that break for the advertisers, that turn to corporate support. I see the hope as public media, media that's brought to you by the listeners and the viewers who are deeply committed to independent information. When we cover war, not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers. When we cover climate change, not brought to you by the oil, the gas, the coal companies, the nuclear companies. When we cover the healthcare debate in this country, not brought to you by big pharma, the drug companies, or by the insurance industry, but brought to listeners and viewers by listeners and viewers who feel that information is power, that information is essential. It's the oxygen of a democracy. Back to the exception to the rulers. Our motto at Democracy Now! Is to break the sound barrier. We call ourselves the exception to the rulers. We believe all media should be. What do you mean by sound barrier? Well, so often on the networks, we get this small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. We go to the communities to talk to people in this country and around the world who are at the heart of the story. It's not always easy to find, but people sense authentic voices. I think it's why so many young people listen to Democracy Now! We have such a diverse audience in this country and around the world, because it's that sense of people knowing what they're talking about because they're talking from their own experience. I think that's the best kind of journalism. Providing a forum for people to speak for themselves, providing a forum for
people from different strata of society to debate and discuss with each other the critical issues. But hearing those voices of a great diversity of people, that is the role of journalism in a democratic society.
When did Democracy Now! Start, and how's it funded?
Well, we started 17 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. It began on radio. It was February of 1996. That was the second election of President Clinton, ultimately, though we didn't know that at the time. And I was actually in Haiti when I got the call from Pacifica Radio, where the show was first established. And you know, when they said, "Do you want to host democracy? Do you want to host this daily election show?" I thought it was a very interesting challenge because, you know, I've covered places where people get gunned down when they go to the polls, and places like East Timor on the other side of the earth, and places like Haiti. And yet the overwhelming majority of people vote. Why, I wondered, in this country don't people vote? Or I should say, the majority do not vote. And I don't think it's apathy. And I didn't think it was then. But I was interested to follow the primaries as a kind of map of the country and go to these states and see what people are doing in their communities. How are they civically engaged? So we did the show, and the election happened, and we thought that would be it. But there was more demand for the show after the election than before. And so we were broadcasting on a few dozen community radio stations. And it kept growing. And then the week of September 11th happened. That week, coincidentally, I'm talking about September 11, 2001, we were slated to go on one TV station. It was in New York. It was a public access TV station, and we were broadcasting from an old firehouse that had been turned into a community media center.
Down by the Twin Towers.
It was, yes, the closest national broadcast to the World Trade Center. So on September 11th, we were going to be broadcasting on television as well for Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Now we broadcast 8 Eastern Standard Time every morning. Then it was 9. So the first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center at 8:47. We didn't know it was happening. We were in the garret of this old firehouse. The second plane hit at 9:03. We still didn't know it was happening. We were, though, doing a show that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973, in Chile, when Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president, died in the palace as the Pinochet forces rose to power. Unfortunately, the U.S.-backed Pinochet forces, the Kissinger-backed Pinochet forces, the Nixon-backed Pinochet forces, ITT-backed Pinochet forces, and Pinochet was a dictator who was ruthless, who ran that country for 17 years. Thousands of Chileans were killed. September 11th, 2001 is not the first time, or September 11th, that September 11th is connected with terror. It's happened around the world. I mean, September 11th, 1977 in South Africa. Steve Biko, the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, was being beaten to death in the back of a van by apartheid forces. Unfortunately, U.S.-backed apartheid forces died in the early morning hours of September 12, 1977. In Guatemala, September 11, 1990, the Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack was killed by Guatemalan security forces, sadly, U.S.-backed Guatemalan security forces. September 11th, 1971, here in the United States, in my state, in New York. That was the Attica Uprising, September 9th to 13th. 2 days later, Governor Rockefeller would call out the state troopers, and they would open fire on the prisoners, killing something like 79 prisoners and guards. Killing 39 prisoners and guards, critically wounding 88 others, and injuring hundreds of others. September 11th is not the first time that terror has come to U.S. soil. Ask any African American about slavery, any Native American about what's happened in this country. But September 11th, 2001 was a horrific moment. 3,000 people incinerated in an instant. We'll never actually know how many people died because Those who go unnamed, undocumented in life often go undocumented in death, and they were the undocumented workers around the World Trade Center. But it was horrific. And I think it united us with people around the world who have been victims of terror.
So Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, has been on the air since, on television, since 2001.
Since that day. And then once we went on Manhattan Neighborhood Network as emergency broadcasting, stations around the country, public access stations, started calling and saying, we want to run the broadcast. And you know, we were dealing with breaking news, so I didn't think we could just mail it to them. We didn't have access to satellites at the time, so we started FedExing. The FedEx guys would come, we'd have huge black garbage bags filled with video cassettes, we'd send them out around the country. And then in a community where it started running on television, the local radio would say, can we run the show? And so we're on community radio stations, college stations, Pacifica radio stations, NPR stations, public access stations, and now increasingly on PBS TV stations all over the country. So we started on a few dozen community radio stations in '96, and today we're broadcasting on over 1,100 public radio and television stations around the country and around the world. Our headlines are also available in Spanish for any radio station to take, also writing a weekly column for Hearst, for King Features, to provide a roadmap for people to really see what and read these independent voices that are so often not reflected in the media, but I think reflect the views of perhaps most people in this country.
Funding?
It's divided by the networks that run us, foundations, and listener and viewer support, which is most critical. All over the country and around the world, people committed to independent media.
The exception to the rulers, back to your writing. Journalists are not entertainers. We are reporters. We go to places that are unpopular. Where were you in November of 1991?
Well, in November of 1991, I went to this small country called East Timor, which at the time was occupied by Indonesia. I went there with my colleague, Alan Nairn, a superb journalist in this country, investigative journalist. We had gone there the year before to investigate what was happening there, and then returned at the end of October 1991. Indonesia invaded East Timor December 7th, 1975. At the time, it was President Ford, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. They flew into Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. They gave the go-ahead for the invasion to one of the longest-reigning dictators in the world, Suharto. And as they flew out, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor by land, by air, and by sea, just for a little history. They occupied the country, they closed it to the outside world, and for the next 17 years, or ultimately for about a quarter of a century, they slaughtered the people. One of the great genocides of the late 20th century. The genocide was worse than Pol Pot's Cambodia. The difference was, in terms of people knowing what was happening, Americans knowing, is that Pol Pot was an official enemy of the United States. The president would say that, the Secretary of State, so the media would cover it because the president and Secretary of State would talk about it. And of course, the media should have covered it. But in the case of Indonesia invading East Timor, Suharto was an ally of the United States. And so whether it was Ford and Kissinger, onto Carter, onto Reagan and Bush, and onto Clinton, they didn't talk about the atrocities in Timor. So we went to East Timor to do our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And what we found there was a real hell on earth. November 12th, 91, Indonesia had occupied for 17 years. They killed a third of the population, 200,000 Timorese. And on that morning, the people went to church, to the Catholic Church. Most of the country is Catholic. It had been occupied by Portugal for many centuries, actually. And they went to the Multi-Al Church, the flagship church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, about 300 miles above Australia. And they, after the church, went out into the street in an unheard of demonstration, because in Indonesian-occupied Timor, They didn't allow freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. But 2 weeks before, right after we arrived, the Indonesian military had surrounded the church, and they had killed a young man named Sebastião Gomez in the church at point-blank range. They had a funeral for him the next day. We went, and 1,000 people turned out and marched to the cemetery. And then 2 weeks later, they were having a commemoration procession. In this land without freedom of speech, press, or assembly, the people marched into the streets. You would see a girl in her Catholic school uniform, and then a woman in her old Timorese garb. And the girls and boys would pull out banners that they'd written on bed sheets, and they would hold them up, and they would say things like, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church?" They appealed to President George H.W. Bush at the time, who was here. They appealed to the UN, someone to stop the slaughter. And they marched through the streets of Dili, retracing the steps of the funeral 2 weeks before. Some putting their hands up in the V sign, chanting, "Viva East Timor, Viva Independence, Viva Sebastião." Incredibly brave to do this. And they marched, thousands joined from schools, from work, from home, and they marched to the Santa Cruz Cemetery. When we got there, we were interviewing people. Why are you risking your life to do this? And they would say, "For my mother, for my father, for my village, it was wiped out." And then from the direction the procession had come, we saw hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s at the ready position, marching up in the crowd. You know, when Indonesia invaded, 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. The Indonesian army was armed, trained, and financed by the United States. And on this day, it was no different. The soldiers marched up 10 to 12 abreast. Alan and I were interviewing people in the middle of the crowd. And Alan suggested we walk to the front of the crowd. Because although we knew that the Indonesian military had committed many massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. And we thought maybe, just maybe, our presence could head off this attack. We always hid our equipment, because anyone caught talking to a Western journalist could be disappeared, could be killed. But this time, we wanted to make clear who we were. I took my tape recorder out. I slung it over my shoulder. I put my headphones on. I held up my microphone like a flag. Alan put the camera above his head. Alan was writing for the New Yorker magazine at the time. We walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up. They rounded the corner. They swept past us, and without any hesitation, without any warning, without any provocation, they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. A group of soldiers gathered around me. They pulled my microphone away, waving it in my face as if to say, "This is what we don't want." And then they took me down, beating me with their rifle butts and boots. Alan had gotten a photograph of them opening fire. And then he threw himself on top of me to protect me. They took their US M16s, they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we were laying in the road. Alan was covered in blood. The soldiers then put the guns to our heads in firing squad fashion. And they shouted two things. They've now stripped us of everything. The only thing I had left was my passport and my skirt, and I threw it at them. And they were shouting two things: Australia and politique. They were shouting politique because they were saying it was political for us to witness this. But that's our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And they were asking if we were from Australia, chanting, "Australia, Australia." And we knew how dangerous that was for us. 17 years before, when Indonesia invaded East Timor, there were 5 Australian-based journalists that were covering the invasion. The Indonesian military lined them up against a house in a town called Balibo, and they executed them all. There was a 6th journalist, and the day after the invasion, December 8th, 1975, his name was Roger East. He was reporting from a radio station in Dili for the World. He was the last Western journalist there. And they broke into the radio station. They dragged him out, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor with so many thousands of Timorese. The Australian government hardly protested the killing of their journalists. We believe because years later, Australia and Indonesia would sign the Timor Gap Treaty, dividing Timor's oil between Australia and Indonesia. Oil is the source of so much pain in the world. And so as we lay there, Alan covered in blood, and they are shouting at us, Australia, with the guns to our heads, we shouted back, no, America, America. I had thrown my passport at them. I was born here in Washington, D.C. And they would kick me in the stomach when I'd get my breath back, and as others joined the firing squad, I would say, America, America. At some point, they took the guns from our heads. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never had to pay for killing the Timorese. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up. We were able to get into it. The driver of the Red Cross Jeep picked up this old Timorese man who was in a sewer ditch next to us. And every time the soldiers beat him, he would put up his hands in the prayer sign and they would smash the butts of their rifles into his face. We drove off to a hospital. Timorese stopped us to try to get away from this killing field, and we drove as a human mass to the hospital as they hung off the spare tire on the back on top of us, on top of the Jeep. At the hospital, when we got out, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us. Not because we were in worse shape than the people that were being dragged there. Young people dragging sisters or brothers who'd been shot but not yet dead, hoping they could be operated on. But I think because of what we represent to the people of Timor, and not just Alan Nairn and I, but I think Americans, and not just to Timor, but people all over the world, I think we represent two things, the shield and the sword. The sword, because all too often the U.S. government uses the weapons, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, or provides them to human rights abusing regimes, like Indonesia. But they also see the American people as the shield. You know, we can call our Congress member and say, don't do that. People can march in the streets here. And they saw that shield bloodied that day. And that just deepened their despair. We went into hiding. We knew we had to get out of the country. We had not succeeded in stopping the massacre. The Indonesian military killed more than 270 Timorese on that day. We went to the bishop's house, at the time Bishop Carlos Jimenez Bello. He later won the Nobel Peace Prize. And Alan was covered in blood. And he gave him a new shirt so we could clean him up. His head under his dark hair glistened like a bathing cap of blood. But if we could get to the airport before the new shirt was drenched with blood, maybe we could get out on the only plane out. Get to fly out of East Timor and get word to the outside world. We made it to the airport. They'd closed down the whole city. The jeeps of soldiers were combing through the streets now. We heard gunfire in other parts of Delhi. Got to the airport. The military occupied the airport because it was a military-occupied country. They were shouting security when we came. We don't know if they had decided not to kill us at the massacre site, and so now they just wanted us out, or if there was a gap in communications. But at some point, they decided to let us get on that plane. Alan had electrical charges going through his body from the beating, had to walk very, very slowly. We walked onto the tarmac, onto the plane, and as the flight attendants closed the plane, they handed me a silver bowl as we were flying out of Timor with water, and they said, clean him up. We made our way to West Timor, which is Indonesia, and then to Bali. Made a call to the West. Alan reported in detail what had taken place, and when we were in hiding, we had someone take 18 pictures of us, because they had confiscated all our equipment. We knew that they would deny anything had happened, but then they'd have to explain what happened to us. And I hid that film away. And I had taken a towel from Bishop Bello and wrapped Alan's bloody shirt under it around my skirt so that at least we could show this evidence. And so when we got to Bali and Alan made the call to the West, I kept wiping the phone off because the blood from his head was drenching the phone. We then got onto a flight to Guam, and we went to Guam Memorial Hospital where they operated on Alan, sewing up his head. And it was there in the Guam Memorial Hospital emergency room that all the press from around the world called in. It became a kind of switchboard for the press. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Voice of America, BBC. What happened? What happened here? Of course, Indonesian military denied anything took place. And then an ambulance. Alan never stopped telling the story, even as they were sewing up his head. He had the phone glued to his ear. We were brought to a kind of CNN outpost, a cable studio. Someone and developed the photographs that we had gotten out. And we showed them, and we said a massacre has taken place. Came to the United States when we got to Washington after Ellen was released from the hospital. Within hours, they re-sewed up his head. We had a news conference at the National Press Club. We described the weapons that were used. We said a massacre has taken place. A nationwide movement grew up around the United States and around the world calling for the U.S. to stop arming the Indonesian regime. In 1999, 8 years later, the Timorese got a chance to vote for their freedom in a UN-sponsored referendum. And in a sadistic goodbye operation, as the people went to the polls in Timor, the Indonesian military burned East Timor to the ground, killing more than 1,000 more Timorese in that voting process. The UN ran East Timor for 3 years, and then on May 20th, 2002, I had tried to get in for the referendum, but the Indonesian military caught me going through Bali and Jakarta and deported me. But 3 years later, I came through Australia, and May 20th, 2002 was a remarkable day. Alan Nairn also got into Timor then. It was about midnight. About 100,000 Timorese gathered in Tasitolo, a sandy plain outside of the capital, Dili. Then the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave a speech, and then Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of Timor, who had long been imprisoned by the Indonesian military, ascended the stage. He was the founding president of the new country, and he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. There was this fireworks display. You could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the people of Timor. They had resisted, and they had won at an unbelievably, unacceptably high price. But this nation of survivors had prevailed. And it's a lesson to all of us, 11 years after East Timor was established as an independent nation. Whether we are journalists or business people, professors, doctors, artists, students, whether we are librarians, whether we are employed or unemployed, we have a decision to make every day, every hour of every day, whether we want to represent the sword or the shield.
And good afternoon from Washington. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and this is our in-depth program. One author, his or her body of work, and 3 hours with your phone calls, tweets, Facebook comments, and emails. Our guest this month, Amy Goodman, co-host of Democracy Now! Ms. Goodman's 5 nonfiction books begin from 2004, The Exception to the Rulers, exposing oily politicians, war profiteers, and the media that love them. In 2006, she came out with Static, Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back. Standing Up to Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times, came out in 2008, co-written with her brother David Goodman. The Sound Barrier in 2009, and finally her most recent, The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope, came out last year. If you'd like to participate in our conversation this afternoon, 202 is the area code, 585-3880. For those of you in the East and Central time zones, 585-3881. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, and you can also make comments on social media. You can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/booktv. It's posted right up there at the top of that page, and you can make a comment under the section, the Amy Goodman section, or you can send us an email, booktv@cspan.org. And finally, you can send in a tweet as well. @booktv is our Twitter handle. Amy Goodman, the most recent book, The Silenced Majority. Where did the D come from?
Well, I really do think that those who are concerned about war, the people who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, people who are concerned about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back.
Do you consider yourself objective?
I consider myself fair and accurate, and I think that that is the highest aspiration a journalist can have.
How do you define democracy? And are we a democracy here in the States?
I mean, I think people have different definitions, but it's about people in charge of their government, people participating in their government. And I think that we have to strive for that every single day. Democracy Now! Is a grassroots global news hour. And I think providing a forum for people to have these discussions, it's the highest mission of a journalist, to continually raise issues, to hear them hashed out. There's not only two sides of an issue, there can be many sides of an issue, many different perspectives, and to try to bring those perspectives out and not just give voice to those in power. I think the media can be the great equalizer, just as the internet can be, providing a forum, no matter what strata of society you're in, to be able to talk to each other. And that's the role that journalism must play in ensuring a democratic society.
One of the sections in your newest book, The Silenced Majority, you talk about trying to get into Canada to give a speech.
Well, on Democracy Now! Every year we travel around the country, and we broadcast from community media, public television, public radio stations all over the country, and do fundraisers for them because of the way public media is supported, listeners and viewers, and they come out, and part of our mission is to shore up public media. So you're describing a situation in 2009 where my colleague Dennis Moynihan and I, who wrote with me Breaking the Sound Barrier and The Silenced Majority, were going from Seattle, speaking there. Just like 2 days ago, we broadcast in Denver from the Denver Open Media, which is public access in Denver, where we broadcast every day. But then we went to the studio, and it was the first time this station had actually done a global broadcast. We pull a satellite truck up, we work with the people there, students, volunteers, and we do this broadcast. So that's what we were doing in 2009. We broadcast from Seattle, and then we were it was Thanksgiving time here, and we figured the talks wouldn't be happening here, so we'd talk Turkey and Canada. And we were invited by 3 community media outlets, public radio and television in Canada, to give a talk at the Vancouver Public Library. We broadcast across Canada as well. So we're crossing the border, 2 colleagues and I, and we're about an hour from Vancouver, and they pulled us aside, the customs, and when I handed over my passport, and they said, we want you to come into the facility. It was pouring rain. We're already late for the talk. This was not a good sign. So we pulled over, went into this big warehouse facility, and they said, Ms. Goodman, can you come forward, please? So we went forward. I said, we have to get to this talk. Can I at least, if I'm entitled to a phone call, I don't know in Canada, can I call the chief librarian of the Vancouver Public Library to say we're going to be late? And they said, we want to know what you're talking about tonight. And I said, what I'm talking about at the library? And they said, yes, hand over your notes. So I said, are you serious? So I said, it's a public talk, you could come. They said, we want your notes now. I said, well, I don't actually give speeches like that. So I don't really have notes in that way. You're in a kind of no man's land on the border. And I knew I couldn't put up too much of a fight because we would just miss the talk entirely. And so I said, what I do is I pretty much riff off the columns in the book, and that book was Breaking the Sound Barrier. Bill Moyers wrote an introduction to it about the importance of independent media. So I said, I pretty much just riff off of the book. And they said, then give us the book. Well, our car was filled with books, so I went out to the car, I got a copy of the book, I handed it to the customs agent, to the border guard, and one of them started reading it. I thought that was a good thing. Another one started writing in pencil everything I was saying, and another was typing into the computer. And they said, tell us, what are you going to say? I said, well, I thought I'd start with the last column. That is about the healthcare fight in the United States. And I said, interestingly, Sarah Palin's book had come out at the same time, and she also went to Canada to speak about it. I said, she was reaming your healthcare system. You didn't detain her. Here, I'm talking about some of the virtues of your healthcare system. They didn't find this humorous. And I said, well, this is about And maybe I could take the book, because the title of the column, the last column in the book, was, and I thought, well, I read it to them. It was about, I said, healthcare reform needs an action hero. Imagine the scene, America 2009, 18,000 people have died in 1 year, an average of almost 50 a day. Who's taking them out? Who's killing them? To investigate, President Obama might be tempted to call on Jack Bauer, the fictional rogue intelligence agent from the hit TV series 24, who invariably employs torture and a host of other illegal tactics to help the president fight terrorism. But terrorism isn't the culprit here. It's lack of adequate health care. So maybe the president's solution isn't Jack Bauer, but rather the actor who plays him. Right. The star of 24 is Kiefer Sutherland, whose family has a very deep connection to health care reform in Canada, I said to the border agents. Tommy Douglas is his grandfather. Tommy Douglas, the most famous Canadian, I think voted by CBC in 2004 as the greatest Canadian. Tommy Douglas was the premier of Saskatchewan, and as a kid he almost lost his leg, and the doctor saved him, and he felt that public health care was critical. And so he fought for public health care just in Saskatchewan. Who took him on, remarkably enough? The AMA, the American Medical Association, afraid the contagion would spread south. That's public national health care. Now, they won in Saskatchewan, and it became so popular, it spread across Canada and became Canada's national health care system. And so this is what I'm telling the border guards, and they're sitting there and they're saying yes, and they're writing what I'm saying down. And I said, so maybe I talked about how Kiefer Sutherland had gone to Alberta and talked about how you mustn't privatize health care here in Canada. If he would speak to his audience in the United States, maybe we would get public health care passed in the United States. And they looked at me. They said, what else are you talking about? So I said, well, I was going to talk about the economy, the terrible recession, depression we are suffering from. What else? So I thought, well, maybe this is what they're getting at. I said, I will be discussing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What else are you talking about? I said, well, that about does it. I mean, it's only an hour talk. And they said, are you denying that you're going to be talking about the Vancouver Olympics? No, they said, are you denying that you're going to be talking about the Olympics? And anyone who knows me knows I don't deal that much with sports. I like to play them, but so I said, the Olympics? You mean that President Obama just went to Copenhagen to try to get the Olympics in Chicago? And they said, and he didn't get them. I said, I know that. And they said, you mean the Rio Olympics? They said, and that made them think that I wasn't telling the truth, because the Vancouver Olympics were coming up, which I wasn't really particularly aware of. Are you denying that you're coming here to talk about this? And I said, well, until now, I wasn't planning to talk about the Vancouver Olympics. They pulled me aside in a room, took my picture, took my colleagues' pictures. They stapled documents into our passport. I said I wasn't aware we needed a visa to come into your country. And I opened it up and said we had 48 hours to stay in Canada. That's as long as our trip was going to be. I was speaking at the University of Victoria and at the library. So we raced up, and thank goodness for Canadians, they'd all gone out for beer. The audience had come back threefold larger because of what had taken place. I gave my talk, discussed the Vancouver Olympics with them, actually asked more, why would people be so concerned? Raced over the next night to speak at the University of Victoria, and interestingly, we stayed at a bed and breakfast, and everyone was having tea right before dinner at 6 o'clock. And I sat down quietly in this room of the bed and breakfast where all the older folks were having their tea, and they turned on the news, and the first story was about me getting detained, and everyone looks over at me. I said, oh no, I'm just here to give a speech. It became a very big story in Canada because the second story was about how in the Vancouver City Council had voted that anyone who put up a sign against the Olympics, their house could be raided if athletes could not speak about the corporations that were sponsoring the Olympics. So the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association was involved. So there was a great outcry about this. It got a lot of attention in Canada that they would detain an American journalist, demand to know what I would say, and if it wasn't satisfactory to them, keep me from coming into the country. So we did come back to New York, and the next show we did was about the Vancouver Olympics. But let it never be said that the state determines what it is that Democracy Now! Broadcasts. But on that day, it certainly provided fodder for a show.
2 more questions. Amy Goodman, how many speeches do you give a year?
Many. We did, with the Silence Majority, about 100 city tours, sometimes 3 in a day. As we're traveling, we do the show in the morning, and then we go to universities. We have public events, and mainly they are fundraisers for community media stations around the country.
Most of your books are dedicated or in memory of your parents?
Yes.
Who were and are they?
My wonderful parents, George and Dari Goodman. My dad died about 12 years ago. He was a physician, an ophthalmologist, where we grew up in Bayshore, New York, in Long Island. And he was just committed to our community being a better place. I don't know if they even talked about people being activists then. My mother, too, deeply committed to peace. She was a social worker. She taught women's history and literature in local community colleges. And I mean, the example of my mother, who died a few years ago, a truly wonderful woman, such a role model for us all, beloved in the community, as my father was. She taught women's literature and history at local community colleges, you know, continuing ed for truck drivers and cops and whoever, you know, they'd get a couple of credits and it would mean a higher salary. So they'd come and they thought, okay, we'll take Czech lit, right? We'll take women's literature, it'll be easy. And she's teaching them about Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison, the great writers, and soon they bring their wives. This was the time of women's liberation in the 1970s, their daughters. Oh, is this what they're talking about, the men would say? And by the end, the classrooms would be packed with those enrolled and their families. And then she went into social work. My dad was involved with Physicians for Social Responsibility. He was a very famous face in the local Long Island railroad stations because they had made this poster. He looked exactly like Peter Sellers, but they made this poster of a doctor in a white jacket with a stethoscope, with a nuclear mushroom in the stethoscope, and it said, "Your doctor is worried." So my dad also led the task force in our community in Bayshore when I was in elementary school, was chosen to lead a task force to integrate the schools of our community. We had a diverse community, Bayshore, but it was pretty much de facto segregation where people lived. And so the schools would be the great equalizer. And I would go with him to cafeterias and auditoriums of the schools. There would be 1,000 screaming parents. And I watched as he just, I mean, death threats against this task force that was going to decide what to do. But ultimately how he just so judiciously made his way through to a more just solution in our community. That is my parents. I've lost my parents, but their legacy lives on in me and my brothers and all the community, and they've been such an inspiration to us.
Amy Goodman is our guest, author and host of Democracy Now! And now it's your turn. We're going to begin with John in Santa Barbara, California. Hi, John.
Hi. As I was waiting, I was trying to think, what show have I watched longer than Democracy Now? And I realized it's C-SPAN I've watched longer than Democracy Now.
We'll take that.
But anyways, there is a solution to all these problems, and it's in the Constitution. It's the Article 5 Convention. Congress put out a paper last year about the Article 5 Convention, and all we need is people like Amy Goodman and Peter Slen and C-SPAN and Brian Lamb to say, hey guys, it's time for us to dust off the Constitution and hold the convention. People fear a convention thinking that it's going to be controlled, but it's just open discussion. So there's nothing to control, and this would allow for this discussion that you were talking about earlier, Amy, where the people can actually come together and build consensus. So my question is, at any point will C-SPAN and Democracy Now! Start talking about the need for an Article 5 convention?
Amy Goodman.
Explain a little more what it is about.
He is gone. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay.
I moved on to another caller, but he's talking about a potential constitutional convention.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'd have to learn more about it. I don't want to be one of those pundits who comments on something I don't know about.
John in Fairfax, Virginia. Hi, John.
Hi, Peter, Amy.
Hi.
I think you brought tears to my eyes for the first time watching C-SPAN, making a remarkable witness to history for us all. I'm torn in the mornings whether I should continue with watch Democracy Now! And leave C-SPAN, but luckily I can now listen to you at 5 on WPFW and 6 o'clock on WHUT
Yes.
TV. So I appreciate all the ability to catch C-SPAN and catch you two on the same day. I'd like to recommend that you have more authors and book reports that also have a truth story to tell, particularly about 9/11 and the war on drugs. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You talk about book authors, and I was just in Denver for a conference, and remarkably, I met a woman who you will soon hear her story. Her name is Carlotta Walls-Lanier, and for folks who live in Little Rock, Arkansas, you know this story, but it's also a story that made history in this country. She wrote a book, and I talked to her yesterday, and we'll be soon broadcasting this interview, but I was so moved by her story. Carlotta Walls was the youngest member of the Little Rock Nine. She was 14 years old in 1957 when she signed a petition that went around, would anyone like to go to Central High? She went to Dunbar, the African American school, but she knew that the resources were at Central High, so she signed up. She didn't even tell her parents. And then the fall came around, and 9 of these young people, I mean, she was 14 years old, attempt to go to the high school. They attempt once. It's right after Little Rock explodes. I mean, literally, the courthouse was blown up. The fire chief's car, they put a bomb under it. But still, the kids went. They tried once, but a wild mob prevented them. Then September 23rd, they tried again to integrate the school. She's 14 years old. They were turned back. But on that day, she described how a group of African-American reporters from around the country, you know, from the Chicago Defender in Chicago, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Afro-American, from Baltimore, Amsterdam News from New York, who were covering the civil rights movement, were trying to cover them, and how they were set upon. And so often it's those with cameras, with the pens and the pencils documenting, that are first attacked. And they were beaten and they were chased. And then the kids went back for a third time. It's hard to think about the Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine as children, because how brave they were. And on September 25th, by then, after what happened to the black reporters, President Eisenhower called out the National Guard. They protected them. They went into the school. And Carlotta Walls was the only female member of the Little Rock Nine who graduated 2 years later. She left the next morning. She left that city of so much pain, yet of so much achievement. And it's voices like those that we need to hear all over this country. And she was at the National Conference on Media Reform and talked about the importance of having media that tells the stories of people at the grassroots who are engaging in these kinds of acts of courage, even now, even, more than 50 years later.
Our production team tells us that Article 5, going back to our first caller, John in Santa Barbara, an Article 5 convention is a convention to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Have you thought about amendments to the U.S. Constitution at this point that you'd like to?
Well, we are covering them. As we travel the country, we see these movements building. There's particularly the move to amend, and that's a constitutional amendment that would say that corporations are not people. which is a big movement in this country, the way corporations are treated, especially when it comes to pouring money into politics as individuals, that if you violate their ability to give money, you're violating a person's freedom of speech. And many people consider that one of the gravest problems that we have to face in this country today, the issue of money in politics. Who gets a say? Who determines who the leaders of this country are? Who are the elected officials? And then once they're elected, what they vote for.
Andy Greensfelder emails into you, Amy Goodman. I think Amy Goodman could have one of the best news programs on the air. To do so, she would need to include multiple points of view. Her programs usually have a counter-mainstream slant, which I like because I can get plenty of mainstream in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, New Yorker, or New Republic. If she included a mainstream guest along with the counter voice, we could think through the whole subject, and I think she'd have a fabulous program.
That's an interesting point. I'm right here going to Democracy Now!, looking at our broadcast from just this past week. We had a really interesting debate. We have many, many debates on Democracy Now!. Two men from Nelson, Georgia, and they were, Nelson is the second city in Georgia to pass a resolution that, pass a law. The city council passed it unanimously, that every head of household must have a gun. So we had two members of Nelson on, two residents of Nelson, one a city council member who said that that way, you know, people on the highway would pass by Nelson if they were going to commit a crime because they know everyone has a gun. But then we also had on Lamar Killett, who was opposed to this and said, are you going to have me arrested? I mean, there are categories. You don't have to if you're a conscientious objector. He said, I'm not. But are you going to have me arrested? I don't want a gun. And we had a debate about this. What does this mean? But we have many debates on Democracy Now!
Kathleen in Coventry, Connecticut, thanks for holding. You're on with Amy Goodman. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Hello. First thing I want to do is say thank you, Amy. I love Democracy Now!, and I think it's a very important program.
Thank you.
And then I had two quick questions for you. You said there's something in the title of your last book about hope, and I was wondering where you look and see signs of hope on the political landscape. And secondly, you mentioned earlier that you don't think the lack of voting in this country is due to apathy. What do you think it's due to? Thank you.
You know, I had an interest. Well, first of all, thank you for a call. Thank you for tuning in to Democracy Now!, and people can check it out at democracynow.org. I had an interesting experience on Election Day 2000. We were then a radio show, not yet a TV show, and we got an interesting call that morning. We were about to go on the air, and we got a call from, well, they got on the phone, they said, hi, this is the White House. And I thought they said, they said, this is White House Communications. And we were just about to go on the air. The producers were already in our studio, and I was running in as usual. But we got this call. I thought, who would be calling right before the show unless it's an emergency? So I've got to pick it up. The music is always already swelling for the beginning of Democracy Now! And I pick it up, I say hello, and they say White House Communications. I thought, White Horse? Why would White Horse? You know, White Horse is this famous tavern in New York. It's where Dylan Thomas drank himself to death. It's in the Village. I thought, why would a bar be calling us at 9 o'clock in the morning? And so I said, what do you want? And they said, well, the president wants to come on. I said, the president of what? A president of a tavern? They said, the president of the United States. This is White House Communications. It was Bill Clinton, and he wanted to come on the show. And I said, the president, Bill Clinton, wants to come on Democracy Now! Yes, today. He will call you in a few minutes. They said he was calling radio stations to get out the vote. It was when Hillary Clinton was running for Senate and Al Gore was running for president. So I didn't know if this was, if this was a crank call or whatever, and I said, whatever. We went on the air. I said to the producers, as the music is coming down, the president might be calling, so make sure you pick up the phone if he does. And we went on with our show. I went on with the show for the hour. He didn't call. And so who knew what it was? We were going out to coffee because we knew it would be a long day. This is election day. Who knew that long day would stretch into 5 weeks? But we'd get coffee and then we'd start the election day coverage. And we hear a yelp coming from the control room. The next show is on. It's a Latino music show. And they say, get in here. The president is on the phone. And as I run in, all of the music faders are up. The microphones are down. And you hear President Clinton saying, hello, hello, is anyone there, above the salsa. And so I hurled myself over the board and I brought down all the music faders, bring up his microphone. Yes, Mr. President. I understand you want to talk about getting out the vote. And I asked him at the beginning about that. And I said, you know, many people don't vote because they feel that both parties are captured by the corporations. What do you have to say about that? And he responded. And then he was still on, so I asked him, you know, he was considering clemency for Leonard Peltier, who remains in jail. Leonard Peltier is the famous Native American activist who was convicted of killing 2 FBI agents on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1975, a crime he continues to this day to maintain he did not commit. And President Clinton had never spoken publicly about it, so he addressed this issue. And then I was there with the Latino music programmer, and we went back and forth asking President Obama questions, asking about the napalming of Vieques, the Puerto Rican island. The U.S. Navy was doing that at the time, asking when they would stop. Asked him about racial profiling. Asked him, you know, this was a time when Ralph Nader was running, and they saw Ralph Nader as a threat. And I asked him, might he not, President Clinton, be responsible for Ralph Nader's success because he had brought the Democratic Party to the right? I think it was at that point that President Clinton said, I find you hostile, combative, and at times disrespectful. And I said, so then I just have a few more questions. And I asked him about racial profiling because Al Gore had said if he became president, it would be the first executive order to do away with racial profiling. And so I said, if that is his intention, I mean, you both have been in power for 8 years, I said, why haven't you done it until now? But anyway, after about half an hour, he got off the phone. And it got a lot of attention, this conversation with the president. And the next day, I get a call from Newsday, local newspaper in New York, and talking to the reporter, and I get another call, and it's from the White House. And so I just put the phone call with the reporter down at the time we used tape recorders, but I mean just as a physical place to put the phone down, I wasn't recording anything. And I said, just 1 minute please, White House is on the phone. So he happened to hear this, at least my end of the conversation, because I had just put that phone down. This is a time when we're using phones and not cell phones as much. And so I said, hello, and they said that something to do with that would be banned from the White House. And I said, what are you talking about? They said, I broke all the basic rules, the agreement we had. I said, I had no agreement with you. I mean, I was going on the air in 1 second. You said the president might call. That was the extent of our conversation. And they said, we said he wanted to talk about getting out the vote. And they said something like questions 1, 4, and 7 related to that, but not the other ones. I said, but I didn't agree that those are the only questions I would ask. I understood that that's what he wanted to talk about. But, you know, we are independent. We are journalists. And I said, how many other radio stations did he call? And he said, oh, many. He spoke to like 40 journalists. And I said, and all of them just agreed to ask the questions that you wanted asked? And they said, that's right. And I said, well, that's a very sad state. A comment on the sad state of journalism today. And they said, and we said he had a few minutes, and you kept him on the phone for half an hour. I said, he's the leader of the free world. He could hang up if he wants to. You know, I'm doing my job asking him as many questions as I could until he decided to get off the phone, which he ultimately did. Anyway, it was a very interesting conversation that we had, and it got a lot of attention with headlines that, you know, that said we went back and forth. But that issue of an agreement that you have, that journalists have with politicians, you know, I've covered the White House, been at the, you know, been in the White House press corps covering the president, and I'm afraid that all too often journalists engage in, well, the access of evil. that is trading truth for access. You ask the softball questions so that maybe you'll get another chance to ask the president or a question, or the vice president, and then you can come back to your newspaper or to your website or to whatever news organization. You have the actual, you were the one to ask the question. You know, politicians need journalists more than journalists need politicians, and we should not be making those deals. Now, I'm trying to remember why I told you that story, but you asked the question about the listener who just called asked the question about
lack of voting and hope.
Hope. What gives us hope? And lack of voting. That was the first question I put to President Clinton. You know, the idea that people have across the political spectrum, that individuals are losing control, that corporations, that corporate power has is a tremendous threat to democracy right now. Also, the issue of privacy. But what gives me hope is that people also across the political spectrum are organizing. People are, you know, engaging in the highest, in our highest civic duty, which is to participate. And whatever comes out of that, what matters is that it's people, not the corporations, that should be determining the laws of this country.
And Amy Goodman recounts that conversation with the president in Exception to the Rulers, in a chapter called Not on Bended Knee. And just there's a transcript here, and this is the first answer and the first question. Mr. President, are you there? I am. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. You are calling radio stations to tell people to get out and vote. What do you say to people who feel that the two parties are bought by corporations and, at this point, feel that their vote doesn't make a difference? My guess is that's the last time you ever talked to President Clinton?
I have, let me see, was that the last time? When we, interestingly enough, when East Timor became an independent nation, he was in East Timor, and they were establishing the U.S. Embassy in East Timor. So we had a chance to actually challenge him about U.S. policy in Timor, which was, people should go to democracynow.org and see that interaction. Journalist Alan Aaron had a very interesting interaction with President Clinton. But no, I've never personally interviewed him after that.
Where did you have the presence of mind to jump right into a conversation with the President of the United States?
I mean, people prepare their whole lives for an interview with the President of the United States. We didn't have that opportunity. You know, he called in, and it's a huge responsibility, whether talking to a president or anyone else. You know, you are there, and not a lot of people get to ask the questions. And so, you know, I see when I hold out that microphone, there are so many people behind us who would have questions if they didn't have to be at work or if they could only get a job. And I take that extremely seriously, as I think many journalists do. You know, what are the questions that make a difference for the most people in this country right now?
Clinton, now wait a minute. You started this, and every question you've asked has been hostile and combative. So you listen to my answer. Will you do that? Goodman, they've been critical questions.
Yes. I mean, that's it. He seemed very surprised by a journalist asking critical questions when he had the intention to get out the vote.
Ernest emails in from San Francisco. Does Democracy Now! Have credentials to attend and ask questions of Jay Carney at the White House press gatherings? If not, why not? And the follow-up, why doesn't Democracy Now! Ever get a chance to interview the president or any other major governmental official?
Well, we do get to interview major government officials. We go out to, we are not at the White House right now, but I do believe if we wanted to be in the White House press corps, we could be.
Why don't you go to
We
the
just
White House?
don't have those kind of resources to dedicate a reporter there now. We do a daily global news hour. We're based in New York City.
Are you still based at the fire station?
No, we built our own studio. It is the greenest internet TV radio studio in the country. For all the architects who are out there, we got LEED Platinum certification, which means the countertops and the in the green room and the kitchen area are made of crushed, recycled bottles, cemented together. In data centers and in our machine room that all TV stations and radio stations have to deal with, and lots of places deal with data centers. We really pioneered a way to, because all the electronics give off so much heat, to work out a way to try to use less energy in dealing with this, because we really do believe that the medium has to be the message. And also, what's interesting about the Democracy Now! Broadcast every morning at 8 live, and then stations can run it all day, but you can go to our website and watch it live online at 8, and then we put out transcripts every day of every show, is that students come and watch the broadcast. Whether graduate students or fourth graders, kids in high school and college, it is a tremendous opportunity, and really in a civic education. After the show, when the guests come out of the broadcast, they get to ask them questions, and we talk about what journalism is today in a democratic society. So it is a wonderful educational forum. We also have lots of volunteers and interns and fellows. But these classes that come they come from around the world, and they come from around New York City. It's been a remarkable experience to be able to hold these forums every day.
Next call for Amy Goodman, Lee in Rockville, Maryland, here in the suburbs. Hi, Lee.
Good afternoon, Amy. Thank you for coming.
Oh, it's great to be here.
I'm a longtime listener. I listen to you every morning when I drive to work, Democracy Now! And I...
Where do you listen, by the way?
In Washington.
On WPFW, 89.3 FM. Jazz and Justice Radio.
Right. I'm a contributor to WPFW.
Excellent.
And I've been a contributor for many years. I really take issue with your reporting on Israel. You vilify Israel and vilify Israel and vilify Israel. And I'm glad you pointed out this afternoon earlier, how objective you are. Because when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to the joint session of the Congress a year and a half ago, he got 20 or 30 standing ovations. 20 or 30 standing ovations by the members of Congress. When Democracy Now! Reported on it, it was not objective, Amy. What you said was something to the effect of Prime Minister Netanyahu shouted down by a pro-Palestinian demonstrator. One woman got up and started yelling "Free Palestine," and she was, not in the Arab countries, she would have been carted off and thrown in jail and beaten and raped. But in the United States and Israel, they don't do that. They just took her off and, read her rights and let her go. And your reporting was that that Netanyahu was shouted down by a Palestinian demonstrator, not that he got 20 or 30 standing ovations. Do you remember that?
Let's get a response.
Well, I want to address the larger issue that you've raised, which is a very serious one, and it's covering the Israel-Palestine conflict. How important it is to bring out the voices across the political spectrum. I fear that the media in the United States, it is changing, but as with reporting on power in the United States, often acting as stenographers to power, we see that with Israel as well, journalists presenting the Israeli government side, and we very much bring out different perspectives. Now, we interviewed, for example, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who is the former Israeli foreign minister. He said it was the most extensive, fairest discussion he had in the United States about Israel. We don't just do soundbite television and radio. We give the whole meal. We'll have extended debates and discussions about these critical issues. And, we interview Palestinian journalists, academics, people on the ground in Gaza, in the occupied territories in West Bank, and we interview Israelis. And I think one area that is very overlooked in the United States is the Israeli peace movement. But I think public opinion in the United States is shifting dramatically. Students on college campuses, Jewish and non-Jewish, have a very different perspective on what Israel is doing in the occupied territories today, whether it comes to the number of Palestinian prisoners that they are holding, the Palestinian prisoners who die in custody, the protests, giving voice to those protests, both in West Bank and Gaza. We had a reporter on what has been called the Freedom Flotilla to document these attempts to break the Israeli embargo of Gaza. And what does it mean to be on the ship? As with other journalistic organizations, sadly, when the Israeli military brought the ship ashore, they took all of our reporters' equipment, computer, camera, and this was more than a year ago, and they've just written and said they're not going to be returning it. It is very important that we reflect what is happening on the ground. These are difficult truths, but the situation in Israel-Palestine must be resolved. It is not good for Palestinians. It is not good for Israelis. It is a conflict that must be resolved.
If you can't get through on the phone lines, you can go to facebook.com/booktv, make a comment there, and you can also send us a tweet. @BookTV is our Twitter handle. This is from our Facebook page. Amanda has sent several tweets and Facebook comments, so I wanted to address a couple of hers. Is there one place on earth you haven't traveled that you would like to?
Oh, there are many places I haven't traveled. But what we do at Democracy Now! Is we speak with people all over the world. There is a new film which I recommend to everyone that's coming out in April, as well as a book. My colleague Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy started working at Democracy Now! In the late 90s, and we went to Nigeria together, and we covered the Niger Delta, particularly looking at Chevron. A few years before, when I was doing the local morning show on BAI, and maybe I should just quickly say what the Pacifica stations are, because I started at WBAI in New York. Almost 65 years ago in Berkeley, California. It was a war resister who came out of the detention camps after World War II, a man named Lou Hill, who said there has to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And so Pacifica was born. The first Pacifica station, KPFA in Berkeley, that was 1949. Then KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. WBAI in New York, 1960. The station here in Washington is WPFW, the youngest of the 5 stations, 1977. And KPFT in Houston, Texas. That's the 5 Pacifica stations. KPFT is very interesting. It went on the air in the spring of 1970, and it's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They went on for a few weeks. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. When they got, the silver lining of this was that it's not as if Pacifica had the money to advertise this new station, and it certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. When they got back on their feet, rebuilt their transmitter, the Klan blew it up again. And I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear a Palestinian child, or an Israeli grandmother, an aunt from Iraq, or an uncle from Afghanistan telling their story, it makes it much more difficult to caricature or stereotype. It begins the process of understanding, of finding common ground. You don't have to agree with them. How often do we agree with our family members? But you start to understand where they're coming from. I believe the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded all too often as a weapon of war. And I think that has to be challenged.
One more question from Amanda, which is...
Oh, but let me just say, I don't know if I said the name of Jeremy. So Jeremy and I went to Nigeria.
Yes, Jeremy Scahill.
I almost... So Jeremy was a producer with Democracy Now!, and then he wrote the book Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, a remarkable book that everyone should read. And then his latest book is just coming out in the next few weeks, actually next week, and it's called Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. And his film by the same title is also coming out. And the film won a major award at the Sundance Film Festival. It's opening in theaters across the country. A very important film about covert wars waged by the United States and about JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, and what is happening, especially around the issue of drone attacks from Yemen to Somalia to Pakistan. And it's very interesting. We know what is done in our name. So Jeremy and I went to Nigeria at the end of the 90s, and we went to the Niger Delta to investigate. I had met a man a few years before when I was just on the local station, WBI, doing a show called Wake Up Call. He was brought in by a Nigerian activist. They said, "Can you interview him this morning?" I said, "I'm sorry, our show was full up, but maybe you could come back another day." I hadn't heard of him. And he said, "I'm sorry, he's here for one day and he needs to go on." And I said, "Well, I don't know." "Okay, 2 minutes." And he introduced himself. His name was Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa, one of the most famous Nigerians. He was the writer of the most famous soap opera in Nigeria, then threw in his lot with his people, the Ogoni people. And he was taking on Shell Corporation, which crisscrossed Ogoni land with these pipes. And unlike the United States, where this is illegal, they would flare off the gas in their communities. And these kids never knew a dark night who lived in Ogoni land because they lived in the shadow of the flame. And he came to the United States to speak about the nexus of corporate and military and government power. He was living under the dictatorship of Sani Abacha, who was working with the Shell Corporation. He said, "When I go home," he said, "I am a marked man. I will be arrested." We dumped guest after guest that morning because it was so remarkable, the story he was telling, and I resolved then I would try to go to Nigeria. Ken did go home, Ken Saro-Wiwa, and he was jailed with 8 other minority rights activists. And within a year, it was November 10th, 1995, after a kangaroo trial, he was executed. We went back to Nigeria. We visited his family in Ogoni land. One of the men in his community came forward after they sang us a song, after we met his parents who have since died. The man came forward and recounted for us the last speech of Ken Saro-Wiwa in court. But then we discovered this other story of Chevron in another part of the Niger Delta, of villagers who had gone to speak with Chevron executives on a barge because there had been an oil spill, and they wanted the mangrove forests cleaned up, and they wanted jobs. And ultimately, the Chevron flew in the Nigerian military onto this barge, and they opened fire. They killed 2 Nigerians, and they critically wounded a 3rd, and others were rounded up and imprisoned. And we did a documentary called Drilling and Killing Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. And it's those kinds of stories that we feel are critical to shed a spotlight on places that Americans might not know about. And you can't gun protesters down in front of Chevron headquarters in California. So why is it that this could happen in Nigeria, in Africa's most populous country? Well, it's our job as journalists to go to where the silence is and to bring back these stories.
Mitch, Facebook comment, "Amy, is capitalism the best system for Black Americans?"
I mean, I think the whole issue of capitalism today is one that must be debated and discussed. What is the best system in this country right now? Democracy Now! Has long covered grassroots movements, and I think people across the political spectrum are deeply concerned about that sucking sound from the bottom to the top right now. We are seeing the largest gaps in inequality, and we have to really evaluate this system. And we need elected leaders who are not more beholden to corporations and to Wall Street than to the people who elected them.
This is an email from Richard Zalewski. What happened to the Occupy Wall Street movement of a year ago? Did it fail to achieve fail to achieve its objectives, is such an endeavor hopeless because the general public is apathetic or unmobilized for whatever reason?
I mean, the Occupy movement, I don't think we have seen the end of it. I think it takes different forms. But what happened in the last 2 years around the world was truly remarkable. First, you had the Tunisian revolution at the end of December 2010, which sparked the Egyptian uprising. And the Egyptian uprising, we broadcast the Egyptian uprising through our reporter on the ground, Sharif Abdel-Quddus, who did remarkable reporting. He was our senior producer for 8 years in New York. When the Egyptian uprising happened, he flew home basically into Tahrir and essentially didn't leave for 18 days. His reporting, he became one of the top tweeters in the world. You know, Mubarak had brought down the internet with the help of U.S. corporation. He couldn't have done it alone. Even when the internet was brought down, Sharif was tweeting out to the world what was happening. He was being cited on all the networks and then being interviewed on all the networks. And, you know, the thugs then brought down the satellites. But Democracy Now! Was bringing out these remarkable 20-minute video reports as Sharif and our videographer, Hani Massoud, would travel through Tahrir interviewing people, doing what really... I mean, Sharif's reporting was remarkable. You met, for example, Hadef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, in Tahrir. You met Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old at the time, former presidential candidate, psychiatrist. She had been imprisoned under Sadat. She'd been exiled under Mubarak, holding salons for young people when they were despondent, saying, how will we take on Mubarak? She would say, we will win, we will win. You would meet the young high school student who was putting out Voices of Tahrir, a broadsheet in Tahrir that was bringing out the voices of people in this uprising. And she would put them out, this group of young people, high school students, in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed lies for so long. And you would meet all of them, the people who are creating this uprising, through these remarkable reports of Sharif. And then he would be interviewed on MSNBC and CNN and all of the networks, of course, broadcasting on Democracy Now! We call that trickle-up journalism. But you went from the Egyptian revolution to what happened in Wisconsin, a remarkable uprising there where 150,000 people gathered at the Capitol, deeply concerned that Governor Walker was eviscerating union rights and the rights of teachers and others in Wisconsin. I mean, what we saw there hasn't been seen in Wisconsin its entire history. And then that sparked, I think, in the United States, what happened in September of 2011. And that was September 17th when people marched on Zuccotti Park. I think we were the first broadcast global TV radio broadcast to talk about September 17th before September 17th. The networks, though many of them are based in New York, hardly touched it for the first week. I mean, they would be walking by, but hardly touch this grassroots uprising. But if you cover grassroots movements, you saw it coalescing, what was about to happen. And they were inspired by what, a few weeks before, you had 1,200 people arrested at the White House protesting the Keystone XL pipeline, which is a decision now in 2013 President Obama is about to make, whether the Keystone XL will be allowed, the pipeline that will take the tar sands oil from Alberta to the Gulf of Mexico. And there have been massive protests around this. The people who got arrested there, some of them moved up to New York and joining many others in New York and others who had come into New York, to really change the paradigm and the discussion in this country of who benefits and who doesn't, and that was the Occupy movement. September 17th changed so much in this country. As to what happens now, police went after encampments all over the country, knocking out the actual physical encampments. But I think it's percolating in all different ways. There's a different consciousness in this country that, again, unites people across the political spectrum, deeply concerned about who has power in this country.
Sean Quixote tweets into you, Amy Goodman, do you think President Barack Obama has been a positive or negative force against the military-industrial complex?
it's very important as journalists that we evaluate President Bush's record, as we evaluated President Obama's record, as we evaluated President Bush's record. People are deeply concerned about what is happening today in this country. I mean, whether we're talking about the Keystone XL pipeline and climate change, or talking about the crackdown that we are seeing in this country on whistleblowers. And this extends from one of the government's top secret agencies, the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is a number of times larger than the CIA. Whistleblowers like William Binney and others who joined the NSA, the National Security Agency, because they were deeply concerned about national security and wanted to serve their country, and then started to speak out about what it was doing after they tried the channels within the agency, deeply concerned about, for example, surveillance of Americans. They were finding that programs were being developed not to improve national security, but to actually data mine Americans. And as they spoke out, one by one, they faced prosecution or persecution. In the case of William Binney, the authorities raided his house, had him at gunpoint in his shower. He was a diabetic amputee, his family terrified. And in the case of others, they are charged, like Thomas Drake. And under the Obama administration, there have been more whistleblowers charged than in all past presidential administrations combined. It's a very serious issue, which then brings us to the case of Bradley Manning, this young soldier who went to Iraq and is now pled guilty to having released hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages of documents to WikiLeaks. Documents that documented what was happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and then the State Department cables, the largest trove of State Department cables ever released, decades worth. And it's astounding, if this is all true, that he was able to do this in the desert in Iraq. But he has been in jail now for almost 3 years. He has not yet been tried, though he recently pled guilty to some of the charges. What message does this send to especially young soldiers who are concerned about what has happened and the direction our country has taken? You cannot hear his voice. On Democracy Now!, we recently broadcast Bradley Manning's voice because someone secretly recorded his testimony at Fort Meade, where he is being tried. Why is it so dangerous to even hear his voice? What message is being sent to people? I think it's way beyond Bradley Manning. It's about what it means to be a whistleblower. And the message being sent is, we will crush you. We will destroy you. What are some of those documents, videos that were released? I mean, when newspapers all over the world worked with WikiLeaks when these documents, because they were so important, so newsworthy. The New York Times, The Guardian in London, El País in Spain, Der Spiegel in Germany. These have been so significant, especially at a time of a crackdown on information. And I just want to tell the story of one video that was released that we broadcast on Democracy Now! WikiLeaks called it the collateral murder video, but it was a video. Well, I'll start with one of the documents that came out of the WikiLeaks papers in Iraq. Was about an incident in February of 2007 where a Apache helicopter unit in an area of Baghdad was hovering, and they saw 2 Iraqis putting their hands up in a surrender sign. They didn't know what to do. This is all written because these documents are written by low-level soldiers, by officers. These aren't peace activists on the ground writing these. These are the logs of daily activity and war. And they describe how these 2 Iraqis had put their hands up. They didn't know what to do. They were in a helicopter. They called back to base, and the lawyer on the base said, you can't surrender to a helicopter. So they blew these Iraqis away. I dare say if people knew at the time what had taken place, there would have been an outcry and an investigation. And that might have prevented what happened 6 months later, July 12, 2007, in an area of Baghdad called New Baghdad. Two Reuters employees, an up-and-coming videographer named Namir Nur Eldin, he was 22, and his driver, Saeed Shama, he was 40 and had 4 children. And drivers in wartime are more than drivers, more than fixers. They're so important because international reporters helicopter into a place like Iraq or Afghanistan. They need to get a lay of the land quickly, and those that drive them around, that take them to, that are indigenous to the area, they are telling them about what's happening. They're introducing them to people. Saeed Shama was beloved in the Reuters community. So here were these 2 men, and they were being taken around by residents of New Baghdad because there had been a bombing the day before. And then the same Apache helicopter is hovering overhead. And what this video is the video taken by the helicopter. So it's recording the voices of the soldiers in the helicopter and documenting what is happening below, showing the video of what's happening below. You hear them cursing, you hear them laughing, this callous regard for life. They're not rogue. They call back and they ask for permission to open fire. They get that permission and they blow these men away. You see the people on the ground scurrying away. Saeed Shama is not killed outright. He is dragging himself away. And then a van pulls up to help the wounded. There's children in the van. It's from the neighborhood, and a father driving the van. And they explode the van, and they kill Saeed Shama as well. The Reuters employees are killed along with the men in the neighborhood. There's 12 people altogether. Reuters asked the military for this video for years, and they never got it. It was only when it was released by WikiLeaks that Reuters saw the last moments of their employees' lives. And we see what took place there. Bradley Manning talked about this in the courtroom when he had his chance to address the court, saying, I felt it was important for people to know what was happening. And you could disagree with him. You could say he absolutely had no authority to do this, and that is fine. But we have to make decisions based on facts and hearing people making their own cases. This is a critical document of war. And, you know, that happened to have happened before the Obama administration. Of course, President Obama became president in 2009. But it's the crackdown that has happened since that has people so deeply concerned, whether we're talking about information about war or we're talking about the men who are languishing at Guantanamo, 166 of them, most of them cleared for release, a number of them held for more than 10 years, and yet they remain there. And now we hear, and we've been doing a number of pieces on this on Democracy Now!, that it may well be that a majority of them are on hunger strike. The Obama administration is slowly admitting this day by day, increasing the numbers of those admitting that they are on hunger strike. But what message are we sending to the world when we hold people without charge for more than 10 years and say they could be held indefinitely? I think that's frightening and endangers U.S. officials overseas, endangers U.S. soldiers overseas. And I think it's something that we as journalists must cover.
Page 218 of Amy Goodman's most recent book, The Silenced Majority. President Obama spoke at the opening of the MLK Memorial here in Washington, D.C. Amy Goodman writes, what Obama left unsaid is that King, were he alive, would most likely be protesting Obama administration policies. We have an hour and a half left with our guest this month on In Depth, Amy Goodman. Our producer, Tanya Davis, often sends the authors that we have on the program a series of questions. And she sent Amy a series of questions as well. Amy Goodman provided answers, and we want to show those to you now. Amy Goodman, 1.5 hours left in our program today, and this is an email from Robert Holman, MD, in Pueblo, Colorado. Given the words spoken by President Obama during the 2008 and 2012 campaigns, are you disappointed by his actions? Will the U.S. ever adopt a single-payer healthcare system?
Very important question, and I'd like to also go back to the issue you raised, Peter, before the break, and that is President Obama speaking at the dedication of the MLK Memorial, of the Dr. King Memorial. You know, here we are on this Sunday. It is 45 years ago. It was 45 years ago on April 4th, 1968, that Dr. King was gunned down at the Lorraine Motel on the balcony. He went down to Memphis that week to stand with sanitation workers who were simply trying to organize a local union, 1707 of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. You know, when we were covering the protests in Wisconsin, for young people who are thinking, you know, now issues are very gray. It was much more clear-cut, black and white way back then. I think people should think again. You know, AFSCME was founded, I think it was 1932 in Wisconsin. And what were people protesting in Wisconsin? The right to organize. Dr. King died for that right. Most people in this country don't realize, you know, they know his I Have a Dream speech, but don't realize as he was speaking, giving that famous address, I may not make it, you know, the mountaintop address. He was there to stand with sanitation workers, simply organizing. Now, a year to the day before he died, on April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, Dr. King gave another address that didn't get as much attention after he died, though we play it every year on Dr. King's birthday, a federal holiday that was very hard fought for by people all over the country and state by state, finally. I think New Hampshire and Arizona were the last ones to accept it as a federal holiday to recognize Dr. King Day. But on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King addressed Riverside Church. Thousands gathered there. And he said, sadly, that his country, the United States, is the greatest purveyor of violence today. He was speaking out against the war in Vietnam. There were many, even in his inner circle, who said, don't do it, Martin. Don't speak out. You have achieved the support of the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States. It was Lyndon Johnson at the time. You got him to sign the Voting Rights Act. You got him to sign the Civil Rights Act. Do not alienate him now. But Dr. King saw this as his duty, as a seamless web. As if he was concerned about injustice at home, he was concerned about it abroad. And I just came from the National Conference on Media Reform, where it was pointed out that one of the magazines that most affected Dr. King in seeing what was happening on the ground in Vietnam was the independent publication Ramparts. So Dr. King gave that address. Dr. King, who is hailed today all over the country, all over the world. Time magazine called his speech, talked about it as demagogic, saying that it sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. The Washington Post, right here in Washington, said with that speech, he did a disservice to his cause, his country, his people. Yet Dr. King wouldn't stop. He continued to speak out against war. And I think that is very relevant today, and why we did that column, and on what Dr. King would be saying today. Would he be invited to the celebrations of his life today? And as President Obama presided over the honoring of Dr. King with the memorial, what would Dr. King have to say about President Obama's policies around war? What's happening, for example, now in Afghanistan, and the expanded covert wars in the form of drone attacks in Pakistan and beyond. In
a recent column, Amy Goodman, you praised Senator Rand Paul. Is it, maybe praised is the wrong word?
Well, I talked about what he did. Rand Paul engaged in a filibuster for a day, and it was quite remarkable. Protesting drone attacks, protesting, and it was not only Rand Paul, but a number of his colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle. Now, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden also spoke, because he, along with Senator Udall, have been also deeply concerned about these issues, from drone attacks to surveillance. What Senator Paul was raising on that day, and we'll see if he raises it again, is could a U.S. citizen be killed on U.S. soil, eating in a cafe, be killed in a drone attack? He detailed what happened in Yemen with the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki. This is a story that Jeremy Scahill went to investigate, former Democracy Now! Producer, with his film Dirty Wars that's coming out. He went and met with the Awlaki family. But not only did President Obama have Awlaki killed, without trial, without charge, a drone attack in Yemen kills not only Anwar al-Awlaki, whether you think what he is saying is right or you think it's absolutely reprehensible. He was an American citizen, and you have to ask this question, should we be doing it to anyone? Killing this American citizen, then 2 weeks later, dropping another missile bomb, a drone strike, on his son, who was born in Denver, Abdurrahman Awlaki, 16 years old. What did his son do? And actually, Senator Paul raised this question, what was his crime? That he was the son of his father? These are very serious questions. I would expand Rand Paul's questions to not only U.S. citizens, but anyone. But it was very significant what he did on that day.
Bill in Washington, D.C., thanks for holding. You're on the air on Book TV with Amy Goodman.
Ms. Goodman, how are you doing?
Good.
Just wanted to see if you might have had a shout-out to Ron Pinchback. Have you seen him lately?
I haven't. I just flew into Washington on the red-eye this morning.
Bill, who is Ron Pinchback?
He's the person who's sort of responsible for bringing Amy Goodman on the air back at PFW. Maybe, well, but that's not really what I wanted to talk about. That was just sort of a social thing. Miss Goodman, I've tried with the Pacifica Foundation and with C-SPAN, for that matter. They're equally culpable in this, and, of course, the major media. Have you ever heard of a project by the Pentagon called the HARP Project?
I have.
Okay, just if I could quickly say this for the listeners who might not have heard about this. It's HAARP, which stands for Harmonic Auroral Atmospheric Research Project. There have been hearings on this that are in the congressional record during the 90s. And if you go to Google and you write in HARP weaponry, you get over 1.5 million entries.
So, Bill, your point with this, asking about this?
Is this system is something that can cause earthquakes. It can do weather modification to steer storms wherever, create them where they aren't.
And what's your view about it, Bill?
Well, the last part is the most important. It's even been shown to have qualities of mind control that could be linked to the Arab Spring. Andrea Mitchell was recording a little piece on this showing that prior to the surge, or about at the time of the surge in Iraq, that they may have used this weapon system, which is based in Alaska, to quiet down the population.
All right. You know what, Bill? Let's hear from Amy Goodman. Thanks for calling in.
Well, I don't know enough about the HARP project. I know it involves manipulation of weather, and this is something I'll look into.
But Ron Pinchback?
He was the former general manager of WPFW. Democracy Now! Was on the station before Ron was general manager, but I haven't spoken to him recently. But if he's watching, hi, Ron.
Jeff is in Long Beach, California. Jeff, please go ahead.
Hi, Amy.
Hi.
I've listened to Democracy Now! For several years now. I'm a big admirer of your work. I just have 3 questions for you. First, I often tell my friends and coworkers about Democracy Now!, and I've repeatedly heard the same thing from people who consider themselves to be progressive, and that is that they're concerned that Democracy Now! Is leftist and has an agenda, and I assume that you've encountered this as well, and I wonder how you've responded to it and how I could do the same. Second, I'm wondering why you haven't interviewed Bob Avakian on your program before, and then third...
Who is Bob? I'm sorry, Jeff, what was the last name?
Bob Avakian, the head of the Revolutionary Communist Party.
Okay.
And then lastly, I'm interested in your perspective around the issue of living a balanced life, because there's so many issues, so many injustices going on in the world, and I just wonder, how do you balance being a journalist and activist, getting involved, making a difference, still being a good family member, a good life partner to a significant other, a physically healthy person that makes time to exercise, eat well, travel, do all the things that make things.
All right, Jeff, let's hear the answers.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, living a balanced life is very important for everyone. We should know what's in the food we eat. We should be very careful about it. Exercise is very important. And we all strive for that. There is a lot we have to do in the world. And whatever job we have, whatever we do, I think it should involve in some way striving for peace and bettering our communities. The other questions were,
Bob Avakian, Revolutionary Communist Party.
We haven't interviewed him. There are many people we haven't interviewed, but certainly would be someone who would be interesting to talk to.
And if I may rephrase this first question, do you consider yourself a leftist?
I don't think labels are productive or instructive. What I say to people is watch and listen to the show. It is amazing who watches and listens. Of course, we don't know most of the people who do, because we're talking about millions of people in this country and around the world. I think labels break down in this country now. I mean, whether you're talking about progressive or conservative, liberal or Democrat, even Republican. I think that people are rethinking the way we live, and you can never assume what people's views are on any issue. And as a journalist, I mean, it is our job to go outside what is considered the status quo, especially in the mainstream media, because I don't really think it's mainstream anymore. You know, we just passed the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And that week of programming we did in the past week, I didn't think it was particularly radical to bring on Iraqis to talk about what happened to their country. But when I watched the rest of the media, there were very few Iraqis interviewed. We also look back at 10 years ago, and this is very important for today. When we look at Iran, when we look at North Korea, and we see the push really in a direction of war, advertently or inadvertently, in North Korea, for example, where is the issue, where is the evidence? We have to start there. And when you go back 10 years ago in Iraq, FAIR did a very interesting study. It's called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR.org. Of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UN, I write about this, and I was just giving a speech at the UN. And the fact that so many news organizations, in the time when half the population was opposed to war, the 4 major nightly newscasts, ABC, NBC, CBS, and the PBS NewsHour. 2 weeks around Powell giving his push for war at the UN, he was Secretary of State at the time, General, said it was a stain on his career, what he did there. It was the final nail in the coffin for so many, because he'd been so respected for dragging his feet on war, saying, is the evidence in? But on that day, February 5th, 2003, 6 weeks before the invasion, he said the evidence is in. And that swayed so many. But, you know, the population was divided. And these 4 major nightly newscasts, these newscasts were so important at this time. They set the agenda. 393 interviews done around war in that 2-week period on those 4 newscasts. What do we expect? 200, 150 would be with people for the war and against the war? No, 3 against the war. 3 anti-war leaders of almost 400 interviews. No longer in mainstream media. It's an extreme media beating the drums for war. You know, in the first book that my brother David Goodman and I wrote, Exception to the Rulers, we call it that because that is our job in the media, to be the exception to the rulers. I mean all the media, not just us. It shouldn't just be the motto of Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. And the second book we wrote, Static, Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back, we called it Static because in this high-tech digital age with high-def television and digital radio, still all we ever get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history.
And the third book that you wrote together, Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times, 2008. How to Stand Up to the Madness, The Rules of the Road. Challenge the corporate media. Number 2, don't follow the leaders. Number 3, question authority. Number 4, speak up. Number 5, say no. Number 6, stand together. And number 7, Take the show on the road. What's that number 7 about?
That's a way to get out the voices of people you wouldn't normally hear. We take the show on the road, and we go into communities, and we bring out the voices of people who are so rarely interviewed, yet, you know, so often you have these media-appointed leaders of communities when they are not the leaders that people in their own communities think. And to bring out these stories, whether we're talking about, some like it hot, the whole issue of climate change. We were looking at the climate change scientists, particularly relevant today. One of the people we profiled was James Hansen, and he's just announced that he's retiring as head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA. But he was one of the early people to testify before Congress. He was deeply concerned, particularly in the Bush administration, that the government was vacuuming the words global warming off of government websites. You know, whether we call it global warming or climate change or climate disruption. You know, some people poo-poo it and they say, oh, you call this global warming, then why is it so cold? Well, the Earth is heating up, but it is about extreme weather. And I have a message to weather people on all of the channels. You know, a lot of people tune in for the weather. You got to figure out what to wear each day. But you know how the lower third, you know, the bottom of the screen that, you know, tells you who the person is who's speaking, whatever, it'll often flash extreme weather or severe weather. It should flash another 2 words: climate change, global warming. Because people shouldn't just be tuning in to see what to wear that day, but what can we do about this? This is not inevitable. We have covered the climate change conferences. Democracy Now! Headed to Copenhagen to cover the climate change summit there. We headed to Cancun, Mexico for the UN Climate Change Summit there. Durban, South Africa. Doha, we just came from, in Qatar, for these UN climate change summits. Why? Does anything get accomplished there? Well, the actual diplomatic meetings are very painful, very bureaucratic, and not a lot gets done. But the thousands of people who come from all over the world, and with our emphasis on bringing out the voices of people at the grassroots, is remarkable. The movement around climate change is so much more advanced because people are suffering, you know, especially island nations. Their countries will be submerged, and parts of them are, the desertification of Africa. They are directly feeling it, but we are too. We just don't hear about it. We just hear about it in terms of weather reports. I mean, whether we're talking about the forest fires from California to Colorado, the drenching rains, the Superstorm Sandy, or the Dust Bowl conditions of the Midwest, we should hear about this as much as we hear the weather, you know, being severe or extreme. Why? And what can we do about it? And that's, we just talk about in this book, just people who don't go looking for trouble, but when it comes to them, how they speak out. Like the kids of Connecticut and their teacher.
Who was or is Bonnie Dickinson, speaking of which?
Bonnie Dickinson was a drama teacher at Wilton High in Connecticut. The kids and Bonnie decided to do a play that year. You know, every year high schools have their annual play, and they wanted to do a play about the Iraq War. And they took the letters and statements of soldiers written home, and they made a play. And they, you know, made the costumes, and they learned their lines, and they were very enthusiastic. I went to Wilton High, and I saw the theater and everything. But as it was coming time for the performance, the principal walked in and said, you know, you can make your sets, and you can learn your lines, and you can keep making the costumes, but you're not performing this play here. And the kids said, what are you talking about? We do a play every year, and we've chosen to do this one. He said, no, you're not going to take on the issue of war. And they begged and pleaded, and he said, that ship has sailed. Then the New York Times did an article about the censorship, and that led theaters in New York, like the Culture Project and the Public Theater, to invite the high school students to do what actors dream of all their lives, to perform on the New York stage. And I went to one of these productions and did the talk back with the kids afterwards. And it was amazing. I did it at the Culture Project, at the Public Theater. The soldiers whose words were taken were in the audience, so deeply moving. And Bonnie was almost lost her job as the drama teacher. These children learned a tremendous lesson. I mean, that if you stand up to the madness, you know, ordinary heroes in extraordinary times. Interestingly, the man who wrote Stepford Wives lived in Wilton, Connecticut, and he wrote a letter to the New York Times congratulating the kids and the drama class of Wilton High, saying, congratulating them for not being Stepfordized. He says the Stepford Wives were based on Wilton, Connecticut.
That's Amy Goodman talking about her 2008 book, Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. A quote from that book: "Protesting is an act of love. It is born of a deeply held conviction that the world can be a better, kinder place. Saying no to injustice is the ultimate declaration of hope." Amy Goodman, your first 3 books have different covers, but your last 2, Breaking the Sound Barrier and The Silenced Majority, both have your picture on it. Is there a editorial decision there somewhere?
Well, those were the book of columns that we do for King Features every week, Breaking the Sound Barrier, and now the latest one, The Silenced Majority. And that was just the publisher's decision. The Breaking the Sound Barrier has this introduction by Bill Moyers, and The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprising, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope, has an introduction by Michael Moore. And these are the weekly interviews that we do on Democracy Now!, and taking one story each week and sort of making bringing that out so it'll be published in newspapers around the country. There's so much to cover. In that week of the 10th anniversary of Iraq, we interviewed Thomas Young. Now, Thomas is a young soldier who went to Iraq, and he wasn't there 5 days before he was in Sadr City in Baghdad, and it was April 4th, 2004, the same day that Casey Sheehan died in Sadr City. He was the son of Cindy Sheehan, one of the most famous peace activists. She set up Camp Casey outside Crawford Bush's ranch in Texas. But Thomas was shot. And he was paralyzed from the neck down. Came back to the United States, and he started speaking out against war after he was somewhat rehabilitated. But then he threw a pulmonary embolism a few years ago, and his physical health started to deteriorate. And he is now making a decision. We sent a camera crew into his house in Kansas City with his wife, Claudia, because his voice was soft, and we wanted to ensure people could hear what he was saying, what he was thinking. And we had Phil Donahue in our studio in New York. Now, Phil, of course, everyone knows from the Phil Donahue Show, sort of Oprah before Oprah. Then he had a show on MSNBC, flagship show, right before the invasion, and was summarily dumped, even though it was the most popular show on MSNBC. It was the 8 o'clock slot in the evening. And we got a hold of the secret NBC memo that came out that essentially said afterwards that as we move into war, we're not going to have an anti-war face on the flagship show when the other networks are waving the American flag. I think that expressing that view that Phil did, or having guests on that dared to speak out against war, I mean, is patriotic. Peace is patriotic. But Phil did a film, his first documentary, about Thomas 7 years ago called Body of War, and has remained in touch with Thomas ever since. And Thomas is deciding whether to take his own life, and he says that he cannot deal with the pain. He feels the Veterans Administration, the VA hospital, has failed him. He's in terrible pain. He had a tremendous will to live, but the pain has worn him down. And I fear that many soldiers find themselves in this situation. I mean, the horrific numbers of suicide we see today with soldiers coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, almost like one a day. And the number, if you put that together with all veterans in the United States, we're talking, I mean, I still find this hard to believe. 18 people a day. But Thomas Young has announced that he will take his own life in the next few months. I said, is there anything that would deter you from this? What if you could deal with the pain? What if, and he said, well, that would be different. But his is a story that everyone should know. And, you know, just talking about activism and what it means to say no, which is also a very brave act of saying yes. Earlier in this discussion, I talked about the Little Rock Nine, but we've also just passed the 100th anniversary of the birth of the great Rosa Parks. And I think it's really instructive to know her story, because the media has gotten that story wrong as well. You know, I remember when she died in 2005. You know, everyone knows it, and the basic outline of what she did is accurately described. But in 2005, when she died, we raced down to Washington because, you know, she was the first African-American woman to lay in state and lay in honor in the Capitol Rotunda. Now President Obama has just dedicated her statue. And then her body was taken to a big Washington church. Thousands came out for the memorial service. Oprah was there. Cicely Tyson was there. Julian Bond, the former chair of the NAACP. They all gave these eloquent speeches, and they had loudspeakers outside so everyone could hear. And we were outside where it's often more interesting to be. And I interviewed a young student. I said to her, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Oh, I emailed my professors this morning." I said, "I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education." So the story that is told, you know, she sits down in the bus December 1st, 1955, refuses to get up when asked to do so by a white bus driver, refuses to get up for a white passenger, and in so doing stands up for everyone, not just African Americans, everyone. You know, when one person is oppressed, we are all oppressed. She refused to get up. She launches the modern-day civil rights movement. A few days later, she goes to court December 5th, 1955, and the Montgomery Improvement Association chooses as their leader a young minister who's just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helps to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. And a year later, a Supreme Court decision, the bus boycott wearing down the city of Montgomery, and the transportation system of Montgomery is integrated. So where did the media get it wrong? I remember when we came down to Washington, I remember the networks that day. CNN, actually, it was a story that they did. They said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. Rosa Parks was secretary of the local NAACP. There's a great book that's just come out from Jean Theoharis called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. I encourage everyone to read it. But Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He was the president of the NAACP. He worked with A. Philip Randolph, the greatest organizer of the 20th century, who helped organize the 1963 March on Washington. He and E.D. Nixon helped organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right? The African-American, the black porters, thousands of them who rode the trains, all called George. Their mothers didn't name them George, but they were called George for the owner of the trains, George Pullman. Gives you a sense of why they needed to organize. And you know the famous story of Eleanor Roosevelt taking A. Philip Randolph to meet with FDR. And he describes the condition of black people in this country to President FDR Roosevelt. He describes the condition of working people in this country. And FDR listens intently and then responds, "I don't disagree with anything you've said, but you'll have to make me do it." And interestingly, when Barack Obama was running for president the first time, he was in the backyard of a New Jersey home, about 100 people there to see him, and he was taking questions, and a man at the back raised his hand and said, "What are you going to do about the Middle East?" He repeated the story of A. Philip Randolph and FDR saying to A. Philip Randolph, "Make me do it." That's interesting for anyone in this country. To be a responsible citizen, you have to make your demands known. But Rosa Parks knew just what she was doing. She was an activist. She trained at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. King had been there, black and white together, learning to most effectively strategize to change the laws. The media denigrates activists. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? And to show how brave Rosa was, just go back a few months to the summer of '55. To the killing of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy in Chicago, and his mother, Mamie, wanted him out of the city for the summer, sent him to Money, Mississippi to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins, and he is lynched. He's dragged out of bed in the middle of the night by a white mob, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When Emmett Till's body was dredged up, and this had a huge influence also on Carlotta Walls, who I talked about earlier, who was one of the Little Rock Nine. Because Emmett was 14, she was 14 when she integrated this Central High School in Arkansas. But Emmett, when his body was sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, she wasn't an activist. She was thrust into this, the agony of losing her only child. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands streamed by his casket and saw. And then Jet magazine and other black publications actually took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they were published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? Every surviving newspaper above the fold, a picture of a dead baby on the ground, naming her, writing an article about her. Every top of every TV and radio newscast, a story of a soldier dead and dying. If on everyone's Facebook wall, every tweet, every email told the story of a woman whose legs were blown off by cluster bombs or a family killed in a drone attack. For just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century.
This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Our guest on In Depth this month, author and journalist Amy Goodman. Jeff in Bend, Oregon, you have been the most patient caller in history. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you for taking my call. You visited us last summer.
Yes.
KPOB High Desert Community Radio. And,
High Desert Community Radio. I remember that journey very well. It was a great honor to be in Bend.
It was an honor to have you. Well, my question is in regards to the LPFMs, the low-powered FM radios, which were intended to fill the void of local reporting left by major media by focusing on local community issues. And the majority of these licenses have been issued to organizations which predominantly broadcast syndicated content rather than local content. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on this and the issues of local grassroots access to the media? Thanks.
I mean, it's very important when the FCC, opens up these windows where there are stations that are made available, either low power stations or full power stations. It is a real opportunity for people to have local media in their community. And whether it's a grassroots global news hour that connects the dots between communities all over the country and around the world, or local programming, which is so important, so people in a community have a voice. These are very important moments. And I just want to also comment that right now, Julius Janikowski, the chair of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has announced he's stepping down. Another FCC commissioner is also stepping down. That leaves 2 of the 5 seats open. This is a very critical time for FCC policy. We know what happened about 10 years ago. I had talked about Colin Powell being Secretary of State and making that push for war at the UN February 5th, 2003. His son, Michael Powell, was the chair of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. It used to be, people didn't even know what the FCC was, this arcane agency in the U.S. government. But they sure figured it out fast when Michael Powell started to try to deregulate the media, which meant, a lot of people across the political spectrum are deeply concerned about one media mogul owning the newspaper, radio, television in a town. And when you relax the regulations, that's what happens. And it is very dangerous when you only have one media mogul towns and cities. It is a very serious issue. We need to open up the discussion. And what counts is not having hundreds of cable channels. What counts is who owns them. And it also applies to the internet. We have to fight to ensure that the internet remains open and free for all people to be able to communicate, and not let the telecoms and the cable companies write the legislation that would privatize this invaluable public resource.
want to acknowledge this tweet from George Cronk. If Goodman speaks for the real American majority, I must reconcile myself again to a minority status, typical leftism. And this email comes from Donna in Tallahassee. Pardon me. I remember another time when Amy's role as a journalist was grossly and unfairly compromised. On March 8th, 2002, International Women's Day, Code Pink was sponsoring a rally in civil disobedience against the coming Iraq War. Several of us, including Alice Walker, Maxine Hong Kingston, and Terry Tempest Williams, broke through a police line in front of the White House. Arrested by Park Police, Amy was videotaping the action as a journalist, but was arrested anyway. I was in the paddy wagon with her as we were taken to Anacostia Jail, and she was fuming the entire trip. Keep up your brave journalism, Amy.
Yeah, well, that was a very significant moment. We weren't doing, I was actually on my cell phone interviewing these women in front of the White House who had managed to break through, asking what they were going to be doing. You know, the police were there lined up with horses and going on different community radio stations and talking to them. And the police, when I moved back, as the police were moving in, you know, they took me first.
Amy Goodman made the statement that flaring off gas on oil wells was being done in Nigeria, but it was illegal in the U.S. It is, in fact, being done in the Bakken in North Dakota. This is an email.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I do want to know more about what is happening in this country and when things are legal or illegal. In Nigeria, I mean, these were apartment building size flares that wouldn't, in most places, would not be allowed in the United States. And I'll look into what you're saying about North Dakota.
Jesse is in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Jesse, please go ahead with your question or comment for Amy Goodman.
Great. Very, very glad that you folks could have me. My name is Jesse Waters. I'm the director of the Bowers Writers House at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Democracy Now!, fantastic organization. And I was just wondering, Amy, if perhaps you could speak a little bit about other organizations that you think are doing the same kind of good work that you are. And let me just take this moment to personally invite you out to our college and our Writers House. We'd love to have you out there and spend some time with us.
Oh, well, I'd love to come, and thank you very much. You know, independent media is on the rise in the United States. All over the country, you see public access TV, public television, PBS, community radio, college radio, websites that are truly independent. And it's very important. And it's so important in a community for people to know where they can make their own media. You know, you can't just walk into NBC, ABC, CBS and start doing a program, but where do you learn the tools? The media can be the most powerful force on earth. It's the way we learn about the world. If we're not from a different place, you know, a place in another part of the world, or a family member or friend is, how do you learn about it? It is through, all too often, a corporate lens, and we need it to be through an independent lens, and certainly need the rest of the world to see us through an independent lens. I would say that is a matter of national security. So there are many different organizations online, media groups, media literacy groups. Look in your community. You can always go to democracynow.org, our global news hour, and we link to so many different, because we interview every day so many different people representing different groups.
And in fact, for that caller previous, you can send an invitation to you as well at that website.
Right.
Who is Juan Gonzalez?
Oh, who is Juan Gonzalez? In fact, I just left him in Denver last night, but he's headed back this morning to New York. Juan is one of the great journalists in this country today. Juan is co-host of Democracy Now! From its inception 17 years ago. He is also a columnist with the New York Daily News and has been for many years. Juan also has written many books. His latest two are, well, News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media. is a critical look written with Joe Torres, another journalist who works with Free Press, which is the organization that put on the National Conference for Media Reform in Denver this weekend. News for All the People is a history of how the media developed in this country, with a particular attention on presses of color throughout the country and the coverage of communities of color throughout the United States. The book previous to that, which was just recently reissued, is called Harvest of Empire. And a film has just been made based on his book. His book is required reading in many classrooms across the country, Harvest of Empire. Film has just been made called Harvest of Empire, The Untold Story of Latinos in America. And it tells a very different story in this critical day around the issue of immigration and why people come to the United States. Whether we're talking about from Nicaragua, from Guatemala, largely from Mexico, where most immigrants in the United States from Latin America come from. And I also want to couple that with the news this week of the dropping of the I word by AP. I mean, this weekend, Juan was on a panel with a group of young women, and among them Rinku Sen, who heads the Applied Research Center and is the publisher of Colorlines, colorlines.com. They were one of the groups that led the Drop the I Word campaign. They've been doing it for 2 years. The term is illegal immigrant or illegal alien. The term is illegal to describe a person. That is what they wanted dropped. And the AP has finally made that decision that you can refer to an illegal activity, but you don't refer to a person as an illegal. It's very important because Associated Press provides news to news outlets around the country. It's not only a news organization in itself. And so that change, and one of the things Juan talked about on the panel is the changes when news organizations stop using the word colored or stop using the word Negro. These are big decisions in a newspaper's history. The question is, will the New York Times stop using this? Will the Washington Post? But AP has made this decision. And I think it also shows in our coverage of this week on Democracy Now! The difference between Democracy Now! And a lot of the other media. When something like this happens, or a decision gets made by a president or vice president or Congress, we show the organizing that went into making that happen. Is it just the leadership of AP that wakes up one morning and says, hey, over coffee, in the morning, why don't we drop that word, the I word as it's called, illegal? Why don't we stop describing people as illegals? No, it comes from years of campaigning. Just the same with legislation, for example, legislation that made public broadcasting in the country. Yes, Lyndon Johnson signed off on it, so often the history books will just say that. But it comes from grassroots activism, and there's nothing that is more American than that. And that is what it's important to show. Journalism is the first draft of history. It's not just the story of the leaders. It's the story of the people on the ground that make those leaders and make their demands of those leaders. And that's what we try to document. How this happens. What are the grassroots mechanisms as they're happening?
Next call for Amy Goodman. We have a little over half an hour left with our guest, Beth in East Hampton, Connecticut. Hi, Beth.
Hi, how you doing? Very big supporter of Democracy Now! And very much enjoying this show. I have a quick comment and then a question.
Hey, Beth, can I ask you, where do you hear or watch or read Democracy Now?
I'm, I think one of the, I think it's University of Hartford or Wesley University.
Yes. WHUS?
Yeah. I think it comes on twice a day, but I'm not quite sure.
This is a radio station that's one of the oldest community radio stations in the country. I think it's the second oldest. Students at Wesleyan University, they ran some wire in the basement of the university. I think it was 1939. And amazing, community media in this country is so important because it shows this hunger for communicating with each other, for bringing out independent voices. So it's great to hear from you, Beth.
Go ahead, Beth.
Get a lot more independent shows like yours because I'm sick of watching the mainstream media and on cable. But I have a quick comment and then a question, if I may. My quick comment is that I am a Jewish American. I am a member of Jewish Voices for Peace, and I do not agree with that commenter on, I think, about the Israeli coverage. I think we're not getting the full message, and I just want to put that out there because the Jewish community is not homogeneous. There's a lot of us who know that there's a lot more to this issue. My question, and my main issue question, has to do with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement, which is a very scary agreement. It's even worse than NAFTA. They're calling on NAFTA on steroids, and one of its main precepts is that corporations will not have to follow the laws of the country in which they're doing business. And it's being negotiated behind closed doors with many different countries in the Asian East area, and even our legislators aren't even knowing what's going on in there. I've written several times to my senator and representatives to see if they can get a copy of that for me. Some of it was leaked, and it's on the Public Citizen website.
All right, Beth, tell you what, let's get a response from our guest.
Well, yeah, Public Citizen is a very important source of information on these so-called free trade agreements, which are often nothing more than corporate managed trade. They're not about free trade. And it's important that we just discuss this, and not only at Democracy Now!, but all of the media, who benefits and who doesn't. And we will certainly do more on that. Thanks.
On our Facebook page, facebook.com/booktv, Jerry Fair posts this comment. Amy, what is your view of Ron Paul and the libertarian approach to society?
Well, Ron Paul, of course, has left the Congress, the doctor from Texas. His son, Rand Paul, is a senator now. We tried to interview Ron Paul many times. We're not able to. It's not one opinion. It is about looking at the different issues that he dealt with. On the issue of war, he was fiercely opposed to war, and I think you see that from right to left, you see why these lines are breaking down, where you have libertarians deeply concerned about war. Certainly, Ron Paul was. The issues of his newsletters and the racism in those newsletters in his early years are of grave concern as well. And it just makes me think today there is no connection, but just thinking of the last few weeks of our programming, one of the things we've been looking at is these terrible killings of the prison chief in Colorado, and then an ADA in Texas, and then a DA and his wife in Texas. Are there connections between these killings? And the concern of, we don't know absolutely, though the Colorado prison chief, it looks like the suspect died in Texas, part of a white supremacist prison gang who got out of jail. But the rise of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, the ABT, is a very, very serious issue. And I don't mean in any way to connect that with the question that was just asked. I just moved on to another topic. But very few people know in this country about the seriousness of the threat of these white supremacist groups that the Justice Department places at the highest level. You could be sure if there were questions about whether these were, African Americans or Muslims, a lot more of the country would know about this. And we must know about what's happening there. These are very serious threats.
Ed Boak emails in from Redmond, Oregon this week. You are advocating that the majority needs to move on gun control. Is that what you're doing on Democracy Now!?
No, Democracy Now! We're covering the issue like the rest of the media, though we don't cover it like the rest of the media. But
do you personally or your broadcast studio use armed security? This is a question. Whether you choose to answer that is up to you.
We don't have armed security. I am deeply...
Do you ever worry about your safety? I mean, not in East Timor necessarily or somewhere else, but...
I just carry on doing my job. I mean, I think on the issue of armed security, I was just thinking about the report that just came out from the National Rifle Association pushing for armed guards in all the schools. We had a serious discussion about this in addition to the Nelson debate, Nelson, Georgia, the residents for and against every household being armed. On that same show, we brought on Judith Dianis of the Advancement Project. They have come out very critical of this call for armed guards in every school. You know, in Columbine, for example, there was an armed guard there, but that didn't stop that shooting. The real issue is resources. I mean, what is happening to our schools? I am a big advocate of public education. Deeply concerned about people having access to education, no matter what family they're born into. It is the great equalizer in this country. And because resources are limited, it is also an issue of where those resources go. Do you make these schools armed camps, or do you put the money into bettering education for young people in this country? So these are the issues we have to debate. I think that question of gun control should also be put to President Obama. I mean, Paul Barrett of Business Week, who wrote the book Glock, The Rise of America's Gun, and is an assistant managing editor over at Bloomberg Business Week, had some interesting bullet points, and we had him on the show the other day, about, no pun intended on the bullet points, but questioning President Obama himself about where he stands on these issues, the words versus the action. Yes, he went to Colorado and now is going to Connecticut to push for gun control. But when it actually comes down to it, when Dianne Feinstein's assault weapons ban, which excluded thousands of guns already weak, went down, did President Obama speak? When he gave his State of the Union address, many might think of it as a time where he really came out for gun control, but there he was just pushing for voting on gun control, which Paul Barrett described as a way for pro-gun Democrats to vote against, sort of getting a pass from President Obama. And I do think this all comes from the top. The National Rifle Association is also just so important now in this whole discussion about corporations to look at money in politics and who makes decisions and on whose behalf are they making these decisions. Politicians who have been so beholden to the National Rifle Association for so long.
Amy Goodman is our guest on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our in-depth program. She is the author of 5 nonfiction books. Here they are in 2004, The Exception to the Rulers, Exposing Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them is the name of that book. Static, Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back came out in 2006. And then in 2008, Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. The Sound Barrier came out in 2009, and her most recent, The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. This email comes from Anita. Amy, thank you for all you do. You're a true hero. Would you please comment on the movement to end corporate personhood and also on Scott Silber's work related to this? We talked about this earlier, but very briefly, if you wouldn't mind touching on it.
Well, there's I don't know about the individual that the person is talking about, but the move to amend is a very important movement that is gaining momentum around the country, a constitutional amendment to strip corporations of personhood. And we're just documenting that as it happens.
Sherry Lynn French from Kauai. Aloha, Amy. I congratulate you on the courage displayed during the Republican convention in Minneapolis-St. Paul. When you jumped a fence to continue reporting, please tell us more about the police and their interaction with protesters. Mahalo and aloha to you and your associates.
Well, Democracy Now! Broadcasts throughout Hawaii, and a big hello to you. I mean, our experience covering not this past Republican convention, but the Republican convention in St. Paul, Minneapolis in 2008 was extremely serious. The Democracy Now! Team went, as many other news organizations did, and as many other news organizations were subjected to. We were arrested at the Republican convention. I was arrested along with two of my colleagues, Sharif Adokadus, who now reports to us from Egypt, and Nicole Salazar, our multimedia producer at the time. And it was the first day of the Republican convention, which didn't bode well for how things were going to go. It was Monday. We were covering a peace protest in the morning, beautiful blue sky day, and about 10,000 people were marching from St. Paul City Hall to the Excel Center where the convention was going to take place that afternoon. We were covering the protest. It was led by soldiers, some in full military regalia. They risk a lot when they do that, who are deeply concerned about war, and then thousands of civilians. So we covered that, and then I went to floor of the convention to cover the convention later that day.
So you had credentials?
Oh, yeah, and all of us do. So I went to cover the convention floor, and my colleagues went back to the TV studio where we were broadcasting from to start to digitize tape and prepare the show for the next day. So I'm on the floor of the convention and interviewing delegates from the hottest state at the time. It was Alaska. And I get a call on my cell phone, come quickly to 7th and Jackson in St. Paul. Nicole and Sharif have been arrested and bloodied by police. I said, what are you talking about? They're in the TV studio. I left them. They said, it was Mike Burke, our senior producer. He said, go over there quickly. They're still there. So I was with Rick Rowley, remarkable journalist and videographer who was filming my interviews on the floor of the convention, and we raced down the streets of St. Paul to this corner, 7th and Jackson. It was an old parking lot. The police had lined the area. They'd fully contained the area, so there was no action taking place at that point when I came up to the police. You know, I have my full credentials on around my neck. I've just come from the convention floor that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates. So I come along the police line, and I stopped. I was looking for the highest authority there, and I just stopped at one of the police officers, and I said, excuse me, I'd like to talk to your commanding officer. Two of my colleagues have credentials like I do. They're inside here because they had surrounded the area. They've been arrested, and we need to have them released. It wasn't seconds before the police ripped me through, pulled me through the police line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, put me up against a car, then against a wall and onto the ground. As I'm still desperately looking from my vantage point on the ground and handcuffed for Sharif and Nicole, my colleagues. I don't see Nicole anywhere. I see Sharif across the parking lot, hands behind his back. I demand to be brought to him. Finally, the police did. We're both standing, hands behind our backs, credentials in clear view. And we were saying, we demand to be released. You can see we're journalists, whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. So then the police take me, and they put me into the police van, and there's Nicole. Sharif's arm was bleeding. Nicole, her face was bleeding, and she was handcuffed. I said, Nicole, what happened? And she said, well, you went to the convention floor. We went back to the studio to prepare the show. We heard a commotion outside. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs if they hadn't put down the tape, run downstairs. They grabbed their camera, their microphone, ran downstairs, and they started filming. Nicole did not plan to film her own violent arrest. You see the film very clearly. The riot police are coming at her, and they're shouting, on your face, and move. She was against parked cars in a parking lot, and she was trapped. She was filming, and she was saying, move. She was saying, where? And they said, on your face. She didn't know what hit her. From in front of her and behind, the police took her down on her face, pulling on her leg, which is dragging her face in the gravel. They've got their knee or boot in her back. The first thing to go down was her camera on the ground, and the first thing they did with that camera is pull the battery out of the camera. If you're wondering what it was they wanted to stop happening. Sharif, who is a superb journalist, just won major award from Ithaca College, the Park Center for Independent Media, the Izzy Award for the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. Sharif is right there, and he says to the police, "Calm down." And they take him, they throw him up against the wall, they kick him twice in the chest, bloody his arm, and they faced felony riot charges. I was charged with a misdemeanor interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. So I'm brought to the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in. Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. It was hours, but there were so many responses from around the country that were, I don't know, faxed, emailed, tweeted, called into authorities that I was released, and then Sharif and Nicole were released. And then I was brought over to the convention center. I think I was in the NBC Skybox. I was being interviewed, and after the interview, the reporter came over to me and said, "I don't get it. Why wasn't I arrested?" I said, "Oh, were you outside covering the protest?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, I mean, you know, this is what I thought. You know, you got to get out there." As Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You know, our job is to be on the convention floor, cover the delegates, talk to them about the issues, get into the corporate suites, or at least attempt to, see who's sponsoring the Republican Governors Association or the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, whatever. And also to be in the streets where the uninvited guests are, sometimes thousands of them. And they have something important to say as well. You know, democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. So we sued the St. Paul, Minneapolis Police, the Secret Service. Ultimately, we settled for a six-figure amount. The Secret Service did not want to admit that they were there, the ones to pull our credentials off, but the police had already told us when we said, "You have no right to pull our credentials." They said it wasn't us, it was the Secret Service. And it was very serious. And we came back and held a news conference because we were moving into the next convention. And, you know, we were not alone in being arrested. More than 40 journalists were arrested that week. And it is not acceptable. We have to be able to do our job. It is not a comfortable one. We have to be in all places. And when the police, when there is a protest and they say, you don't follow this protest onto the bridge, who will be the eyes and ears? Who will watch what is happening? I mean, right now there is an unprecedented trial going on in New York, the stop and frisk case. You know, hundreds of thousands, 700,000 last year, African American and Latino overwhelmingly, young people, usually young men, are stopped and frisked by police. We have to be there to see this. And the question is now, will the police change their policy? It's not a comfortable position, but we occupy a certain role in society, and that is to hold those in power accountable. And we have to be free to do our job. It protects a democratic society.
Amy Goodman recounts that story of 2008 GOP convention in breaking the sound barrier. How was your treatment in Tampa in 2012?
We covered the convention and covered it from beginning to end as we did the Charlotte convention. What was really interesting about the Democratic convention in Charlotte is the first day of the convention, the action that took place was of undocumented immigrants, you know, risking so much, came up in a bus covered with butterflies and got out of that bus and started to walk quickly and chant, undocumented and unafraid. No papers, no fear. No papers, no fear. They went to the front of the convention center. And remember, this is the Democratic convention that they're protesting. And they unfurled this banner in the rain with a big butterfly, and families were getting arrested. There was one gentleman who came off the bus who said, I have paid my taxes in this country for 18 years, which is more than Citibank can say, he said. And with that, he and his wife and his daughter were arrested along with others. And as one of the women were getting arrested as the police moved in on them, I asked her, why the butterflies? Why this image of the butterflies everywhere? And she said, because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free.
Larry in Centralia, Washington, you're on with Amy Goodman.
Yes, what a pleasure it is to speak with Amy Goodman and C-SPAN. Question going back to your exception of the Ruler's book I bought some time ago and I read it several times. I noticed the name Paul Wolfowitz pops up and J. Paul Bremer, his assistant. What was their capacity there in Indonesia? Second comment, Condoleezza Rice on the board of Chevron says what a wonderful job Chevron's doing for Nigeria. Your comments, please.
Well, all of these people are, central figures to the occupation of Iraq, and it's very important that we reflect back now as this country moves on. Well, there are two different issues. One is, should those who held high office be held accountable? Should they be tried? And this is as we cover movements, this is one of the movements that has developed over the years, that if people aren't held accountable for their actions, that history will repeat itself. Now, President Obama has taken a very strong stand on this. He says we should look forward, we shouldn't look back. But there are many who feel that the only way to move forward is to hold those in power accountable, those who had power in the past. And the Iraq War is a very important place to start, because we now know, that Saddam Hussein did not have those weapons of mass destruction, despite the fact that the New York Times printed story after story on the front pages of their papers by Judith Miller, by Michael Gordon. About a year later, they did write an article. They had a box on page A10, something like the New York Times and Iraq. Some people called it their mea culpa. I'll call it their kinda culpa. But they didn't name names, and they should have that box on the front page of the paper as many times as the articles appeared, because that's what sinks into the consciousness of the American people. This whole issue of journalists using unnamed sources, there is a place for that. When a person is a whistleblower and their family or they themselves or their livelihood is threatened, then there is a place for a journalist to make a decision, or a news organization to say, we won't name you. But when it's about protecting a high-level government official, for him or her to be able to put out a lie, and they don't want to trace back to them, that is not acceptable. And news organizations have got to reevaluate when they base their articles on unnamed sources, because the lies take lives.
Ed Keenan tweets into you, Amy Goodman. Amy has interviewed top feminists such as Sandra Fluke, Code Pink. Beyond being a great female journalist, what's Amy Goodman say about feminism?
I've talked about Rosa Parks today, who I think was a great feminist, standing up for women, standing up for all people, standing up for African Americans. I've talked about Carlotta Walls-Lanier. These are women who stood up. There was a PBS series recently called Makers that I was privileged to be a part of. People can check out the website or go to our website, democracynow.org, and we link to it, or just go to the PBS AOL website, where they interview many women across the political spectrum. There is no question, as young women come up to me around the country to talk about what they want to do in their future, how important it is to know who came before us, who were those remarkable pioneers who risked everything to make it possible for a young woman to say, I want a profession, I want to get out there, I want to make a difference, I want to save the world, and to have the confidence to be able to do that. So we owe a lot to our foremothers, and I think that is what feminism is all about.
Going back to standing up to the madness, there's a story in there, or it's in Breaking the Sound Barrier. I can't remember which one, but it's about the gentleman who wrote Over the Rainbow, the music, or the words Over the Rainbow.
Yip Harburg.
Yeah, who was that?
Well, Yip Harburg was one of my dad's favorites, and Yip was, would be familiar to many for the lyrics that he wrote. You know the song, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Unfortunately, as relevant today as it was back in the 20s and 30s. You often know the musician who writes the music, but you don't know the lyricist. And Yip Harburg was a blacklisted lyricist. He is the person who put together The Wizard of Oz. He is the one who wrote, you know, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. His son wrote a book, Who Put the Rainbow in The Wizard of Oz? Frank Baum, who wrote the original book, he didn't have a rainbow, actually. It was Yip himself. And, you know, Yip did the first integrated and all-black shows on Broadway. Cabin in the Sky. One of the people in that play was a guy called Joe. And during the McCarthy era, Joe McCarthy said he was talking about Joseph Stalin or Joseph Lenin. I can't remember who it was. It's very inspiring to see all that Yip brought us, from Brother, Can You Spare a Dime to The Wizard of Oz. And, you know, as people watch The Wizard of Oz every Thanksgiving, what's interesting is that remarkable production got more and more attention on television as he was blacklisted for many years, as many in Hollywood were, and had to use different names or couldn't work at all. And so, yes, I write about and am inspired by, and we did a special on Yip Harburg, and folks can go to our website and they can watch it and read it and listen to it.
And I got it completely wrong. It's in your most recent book, The Silenced...
I'm sure I referred to it in other ones.
The Silenced Majority. But I did want to ask you about this story in Breaking the Sound Barrier. Rumsfeld's Mount Misery. What is Mount Misery?
How much time do we have?
You have 2.5 minutes.
Oh, boy. Well, that's a toughie. Well, Rumsfeld in 2003, you know, got this property in Eastern Maryland in St. Michael's, which is called, well, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was born in Eastern Maryland, and he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. And he was enslaved by a man named Ed Covey, whose property was Mount Misery. Frederick Douglass headed north, started the North Star newspaper, saw media as his forum of liberation, and changed the world. That property, Mount Misery, was bought by Donald Rumsfeld. And, you know, he was Secretary of Defense, and I went down there to the property to see if this could possibly be true. Went to an old black church down the road and asked the folks right before their Sunday service, you know, what do you think? Here you have, this was at the time of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, here you have Frederick Douglass, who was tortured here. What a historic place, but ultimately escaped and was the great abolitionist. And then you have Donald Rumsfeld owning that very property where he was held, who is actually known for torture, right? When you talk about Donald Rumsfeld, you talk about Guantanamo, you talk about Iraq. And I said, what do you think about this? And the woman in the church, the parishioner, said to me, I can't comment right now. We're in church.
Steve in Seattle, we just have a few minutes left with our guest, Amy Goodman. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I first want to express my deep gratitude and respect for Amy's work and the work of your team over many years. I'm very grateful as a reasonable and thinking individual in America. I'm very glad for what you do. Just wanted to quickly ask, having just last evening seen the documentary De Tropa and being still moved by it today, after so many years of dealing with the most difficult issues and most mind-wrenching and heart-wrenching of topics facing our nation and our world, what are your sources for hope, Amy, on a day-to-day basis as you deal with looking deeper into some of these most difficult and challenging of topics?
Well, that's a really important issue, is how we draw hope. You know, as I travel the country, and I'm often concerned we have such difficult issues to deal with, that people who watch or listen to Democracy Now! Will be overwhelmed. But I am always amazed that they say they draw hope from what they see. Because, you know, the analysts on Democracy Now! Are not your typical armchair analysts that you get on the networks, the know-nothing pundits, as I call them. They are the people who are deeply engaged in their communities. So they're not only analyzing the situation, they're talking about how they're dealing with it. So you don't have the sense that something is hopeless. When people take action, that is what is great about this country. And it is documenting those actions throughout this country and around the world. How in Iraq today, which is still torn apart by what happened in 2003, by the U.S. invasion. How do people organize and draw hope? In East Timor, this new nation, in Haiti, that has dealt with so much, from the hurricanes to the economy that is racked and devastated also by its neighbor to the north, by the United States. How do people deal? And that is what I always draw inspiration from. And one of the things we do on Democracy Now! Is we give context. We talk about history, what people have done before, to show the richness of what has taken place in this country and around the world, to give a context which is often so lacking in the rest of the media. There are remarkable heroes and heroines all over, and it is giving voice to those people that I find so deeply nourishing and hopeful.
Jim Freed from Santa Monica. When the White House called about talking with President Clinton, would you have refused the interview him had they insisted on putting restrictions on the questions you could ask him?
I just would. I mean, to me, when they say he will only answer this question, you have to just make clear to the people who are listening and watching what it is that they are saying. But I mean, very clearly there were no restrictions. And if you have restrictions, you can say, I understand that you will not be talking about this today. You can still ask the question. As I say to anyone, you're free not to answer it. You know, we'll ask you what we ask you, and you can say whether you're willing to answer it.
Pat Miracle, another email. Hi, Amy. Would you consider moderating a presidential debate in 2016, as well as determining its format? Or would you please describe what a meaningful series of presidential debates could look like?
Yes, well, actually, we engaged in that this year, 2012. We weren't waiting for 2016. The first presidential debate was in Denver. And so we went to Denver. And you know, before we went to Denver, we went to Blacksburg, Virginia, to Virginia Tech. And there we met up with Colin Goddard. He was one of those people who was shot up during the massacre in 2007. A film has been made about him called Living for 32, the 32 who died. He had 4 full bullets in him, and he took me through Virginia Tech, where the massacre took place. And he is now working with the Brady campaign. He was working during the campaign to get the moderators of the debates to ask a question about gun control, to ask a question about gun violence. Why is this so difficult? So we interviewed him, we toured through Virginia Tech, and then we flew to Denver. And we expanded the debate. And it was broadcast on public television and radio around the country. And we did it for every debate. Let me lay out what we did. There, the presidential candidates, the major party presidential candidates were, at the University of Denver, I think it was. The moderator was Jim Lehrer. And we looked online that day, and we saw how they were dressing the set. You know, you had the bright blue background, and you had the 2 podiums. Each time you didn't actually know in advance how it was going to look, but we wanted to mirror what they did. And we were broadcasting from a Comcast facility down the road, interestingly, in Littleton, you know, where Columbine High School is. And we set up the a very similar backdrop. The blue backdrop, ours said Democracy Now! And we went out and we rented 2 podiums and we dressed them similarly. And we invited third-party presidential candidates in. We invited in Salt Lake City Mayor Rocky Anderson, who ran in the Justice Party line. And we also invited in Dr. Jill Stein of the Green Party. And they sat at they stood at their podiums. I sat in relation to them as Jim Lehrer sat in relation to the major party presidential candidates. And when the debate began, it began with Jim Lehrer asking them a question. I think he said, President Obama, you won the coin toss. You have 2 minutes to answer a question. That was followed by Mitt Romney. You have 2 minutes to answer this question. We stopped the videotape and we said, Dr. Jill Stein, you have 2 minutes. It might have been on the economy to answer this question. Rocky Anderson, you have 2 minutes to answer this question. Back to my colleague, Jim Lehrer, with the next question. And we, of course, doubled the time of the debate because we were adding 2 people. And we had them respond to every one of these same questions. That's what expanding the debate sounds like. That's what it looks like. And we did that in Denver, and we did it with the other debates as well. And the differences you heard, it really made you ask questions about the two-party system and how much they agree and how much they disagree. You know, I sometimes think that it's not partisan gridlock that's the problem in Washington. It's the bipartisan consensus.
We have been talking with author and journalist Amy Goodman. Her 5 nonfiction books, The Exception to the Rulers was her first. Static, Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back was her second. Standing Up to the Madness was her third. The Sound Barrier came out in 2009. And her most recent, The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. At Democracy Now! Is her Twitter handle. democracynow.org is her website. Thanks for being on Book TV.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a privilege. Grassroots Global News Hour. And I think providing a forum for people to have these discussions, it's the highest mission of a journalist, to continually raise issues, to hear them hashed out. There's not only 2 sides of an issue, there can be many sides of an issue, many different perspectives, and to try to bring those perspectives out.